Before we move on to the second reading, I need to ask you, Deputy Miles, if your panel wish to scrutinise this matter.
No, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Deputy Iyer, we now come to the articles. There are 4 amendments. Are PPC accepting any of those amendments?
So the committee considered it for this assembly to determine which, if any, of the amendments should be adopted. It was unable to meet in person to discuss the amendments, but it has produced comments where a majority view was reached, indicating the committee's support or otherwise. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. So how do you propose the articles in second reading?
I would like to propose the articles en bloc, sir.
Do you wish to say anything in support of the articles?
If I may, sir.
Yes, please do.
Articles 1 to 22 amend elements of the State of Jersey law, and Articles 23 to 58 amend the Elections Jersey Law 2002, altering the constitution of this assembly to reflect the decision made in March of this year, reinstating the role of senator and embedding it into our election process again. Articles 59 to 64 make amendments to the Political Parties Registration Jersey Law 2008, Public Elections Expenditure and Donations Jersey Law 2014, and 4 other laws where senators need to be included. Article 65 deals with the citation and commencement. The majority of the articles are administrative in nature, making accommodation for the return of the role of senator. Some are transitional or consequential. I am happy to speak to any of the articles should members have any questions. Otherwise, I propose Articles 1 to 65. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Are the articles seconded? Thank you. So the first amendment is the amendment made by the Connétable of St Helier, and I ask the greffier to read the amendment.
1. Page 14, Article 3, in paragraph A, in the inserted text, for 9 senators, substitute 7 senators. 2. Page 14, Article 3, in paragraph B, for 28 deputies, substitute 30 deputies. 3. Page 15, Article 5, in the inserted Article 3B2B, for 28, substitute 30. 4. Page 19, Article 21. In the substituted Schedule 1, in the second column of the table, number of deputies to be returned, A, in the entry for the constituency of St Helier South, for 3, substitute 4, and B, in the entry for the constituency of St Helier North, for 3, substitute 4.
Connétable of St Helier.
Thank you, sir. I should perhaps begin with an apology that I did not bring this amendment to P2 of this year when we debated this matter in principle. I didn't think of it then, and perhaps I was also drinking from the same potion as Deputy Miller. I was particularly enthusiastic about what the return of the senatorial position could do for interest in our elections. I perhaps wouldn't go so far as she did in the earlier debate, saying that it's put a spring in the step of my constituents. But certainly, like her, I'm aware of many people who rue the loss of the island-wide mandate and who are pleased that it may be coming back. I also, I think, at the time of the debate, was not fully aware of the impact of the proposals on the parish that I represent. It was pointed out during the debate, but I suppose I was a bit blinkered. Once that has been pointed out to me since then, the tables which I have put in my report on page 3 are extremely stark. In terms of overrepresentation, if we take the parish that I'm most fond of talking about when I talk about these matters in the States and the gerrymandering of our system, St Mary, together with St Juan and St Peter, 27% overrepresented in terms of the political power that a person living in those parishes has when it comes to our decision making. And in St Helier North, 41% underrepresented when it comes to decisions being made in this Assembly. That is an enormous disparity. And once that was pointed out to me, I thought, well, I've got to try to make amends for my vote, which, like all of our votes back in March, made senators happen because it was down to every individual vote. There appears to have been a slightly wider gap now that we have 29 in support instead of just the 25. But I can say that if this amendment is not successful, I will not be able to support the introduction of senators because the impact, as I say, on St Helier is absolutely stark. And I do think, sir, that almost I would suggest that when we come to debate this amendment, that members of the current Assembly with senatorial ambitions should admit that they have those ambitions. It's almost like declaring an interest. And of course, there'll be some members who think, well, I may not get in if there's 7, but if there are 9 seats, that's going to improve my chances considerably. I mean, Deputy Teddy said in his earlier speech, why 9, he said. And I thought, absolutely, why 9? It's not a magic number. I would suggest that 7 is a perfectly adequate number to give an island-wide representation. And I think those 7 may be called the Magnificent 7, if it actually happens. I also am concerned that if this doesn't get through, when the senatorial roadshow comes to St Helier, I and many others will point out anybody on the platform who was in this Assembly today and who did not support the mitigation of the deleterious impact of this of the unamended proposition on St Helier. Mark my words, sir, if anyone stands before St Helier voters and says, and tries to justify not putting those extra deputies into St Helier, they will be called out. So it has been pointed out to me that constables and deputies are not the same. Of course, I know that very well. And in my report, I certainly made that point, that constables and deputies are not the same. But when it comes to those critical votes, when a vote is happening in this chamber, which affects St Helier, particularly affects the capital, and the rural seats, the voters are ranged, and it does happen, we can't deny it, it's happened for centuries, it will continue to happen. The rural-urban divide will happen, and that's when you really feel it, that there will be that much more power given to the members of the rural community when they vote than is being given to the urban community. And that's wrong, and we shouldn't support a system which allows that to continue, particularly because I cannot see any disadvantage in what I'm proposing. 2 fewer senators, the same size of the Assembly, there's no effect on the salary, on the pay bill, and I think actually it'll be a more interesting competition for those 7 seats than it will be for 9. So I make the amendments. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Is the amendment seconded? Thank you. Chair of PPC.
Thank you, sir. Striving for greater voter equity and equality has been the focus of successive PPCs and has featured in the recommendations of 2 election observers missions in 2018 and 2022. There's been an enormous amount of work undertaken to achieve a greater balance across the island to meet the Venice Commission's recommendations that any variance in over or underrepresentation should be no more than 15% either way. The system which was introduced in 2022 resulted in variances for all of the constituencies which were in the Venice Commission's parameters. Only 5 of the island's 14 deputy districts had been within the 15% margin. The Assembly's implementation of the decision made in accordance with P2 2025 will result in variances in 4 constituencies which exceed the 15% and produce a severe underrepresentation in St Helier. The Privileges and Procedures Committee considers that the Conotab's proposal which retains an extra deputy in each of St Helier South and North, not only improves the variances in respect of those two constituencies, bringing them within the 15%, but reduces the impact in other constituencies where there is a larger disparity in terms of overrepresentation. Whilst this is not a long-term solution, it addresses, for the short term at least, where voters are underrepresented in the island and improves equity for the elections in 2026. The majority of my committee support this amendment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Scott.
Thank you. I wasn't intending to speak. My iPad actually did the press the button for me, but I will because I'm just going to emphasise that the Common Parliamentary Association, the actual rules, also envisage compromise in the case of small jurisdictions with special kind of quirks. Just responding to the Constable about the possibility of facing St Helier as a constituency if standing as a senator, I have to point out that I did look at his proposal, so I did go through the numbers and I saw that my constituency lost out. And then I actually thought, what is the fairest way, possibly, if you were actually going to redistribute senators and constituencies? Oh, well, I'll probably have to, what you need to do is take one out of St John and that group of parishes, and another deputy out of the St Mary's #1 district, and give them St Helier. I can't imagine that would make me very popular in those districts as well. So I'm afraid you can't win, and yes, there is a compromise. You're going to end up unpopular. It's a bit like politics, whatever you do.
Thank you, Deputy. Constable St Lawrence.
Sir, and Deputy Scott is right. You can't win. We can't win. Because if we could win, we would have won a long, long time ago, sir. Believe me, when I was Vice Chairman of PPC in the long distant past, when Connétable of St Clement, the much missed Len Norman, was Chairman, we strove very hard with our PPC committee to achieve equity. Deputy Mezek will recall those long ago heady days when we used to have so many meetings trying to end up with constituencies that were represented proportionately and as fairly as possible. I have always supported the retention of senators in this assembly, and I can recall the horror that I felt many years ago when we went from 12 to 10. We've had a gradual decline in number. I think the 12 fitted quite well in the benches to my right here, sir. It seemed an even proportion of members across the chamber by roll. 9, when I saw that, seemed okay to me, but the Constable of St Helier's amendment to reduce it to 7 has given me pause for thought, because I do feel that we should be trying to achieve equity where we can. That should be what we are aiming for in this. It will never be achieved completely with the constituency boundaries that we have. I don't like being lumped together, excuse me, constables, with the Constable of St John and the Constable of Trinity. I'm not happy to be part of a constituency of 3 parishes at all. I want St Lawrence to be independent. Oh. Yeah, absolutely. No, and a lot of my parishioners that I've spoken to aren't happy about that change. However, that is what we have. But today, and over today and tomorrow, we have the opportunity to make some more changes. And I'm going to give very close thought to actually supporting the constable on this, because it does go some way, I believe, towards achieving that equity that we should really be striving for, whilst not wanting to make too many changes to actually get it. I'll leave it there, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Conor. Deputy Miller.
Thank you, sir. I agree we should seek. I absolutely agree that we should seek for voter equity wherever we can. And the issue, it seems to me, the most difficult issue we have with voter equity, if you look at the parish basis, sits with the constables. And we will have to do the comparison yet again. Constable of St Mary, I'm sorry, Constable of St Mary, and the Constable of St Helier, who has a vast number of constituents. This debate is not and was never about constables. If we want to deal with voter equity, we need to deal with the question of constables, and that is not what this debate is about. During our debate in March, Deputy Alex Curtis did raise, I recollect, some issues about the position of St Helier. But I think voter equity is possibly simplest looked at in its simplest, by looking at what each individual voter, what the rights of each individual voter are, regardless of where they live. And this is where this amendment fails for me, because this assumes, let me look at my own district, St John's, St Lawrence and Trinity. This suggests that I have 6 representatives as an individual voter. I do not. I have 4. In 2026, ignoring the position of senators, in 2026, if we go with the decision we took in March, I will be able to vote for 9 senators, I will be able to vote for 3 deputies and 1 constable, because I can only vote for the constable in Trinity. Deputy Jean, my colleague, will vote for 3 deputies from the same pool of candidates, and the Constable of St John. Deputy Morel will vote for 3 deputies from the same pool and the Constable of St Lawrence. We do not have 6 votes. We have 4 people who represent us. The Constable of St John this morning said very clearly, and I absolutely respect and understand his views, that he will support and represent his constituents. I am not and cannot be one of his constituents. If I went to the Constable of St John or the Constable of St Lawrence to complain about my roads in Trinity or my parish rates, they would, I fully expect, give me short shrift. It may be if I went to discuss a personal matter with them, they would help. But they are not my elected representatives. I have 4 deputies, and across deputies and constables, I have 4. The same is true of people who live in any one of St Mary, St Juan and St Peter. They do not have 3 constables, they have 1 constable each. The people who are worst off here are those in Grenoble and St Martin, who will vote for 2 deputies and 1 constable. Looking at this, St Saviour, who appear to be -8 down, they will vote for 5 people because they have 1 constable and 4 deputies. St Clement have 1 constable and 3 deputies, and yet they're showing as being up. So I think we need to be very careful with numbers, and I do think what people struggle with coming to this island is the number of votes they have. And there is something very strange that if you live in St Martin, you will vote for 2 deputies and a constable, and yet if you live in St Saviour, you'll vote for 4, depending on where you live. And I think evening that out would be good. But this debate is about returning senators. We voted for 9 senators. People will vote for broadly the same number of people. They will have 2 or 3 deputies and a constable, unless you're in the St Saviour. And we will never agree that. This is a massive, huge piece of work. We would have to take away, if we want people to vote in constituencies, until we take away parish boundaries and create entirely new boundaries, we are not going to fix the problem, nor are we here today going to fix the problem of the disparity of representation in the benches of constables? It is different, and as long as we are voting by parishes, it will always be very different. But to suggest that any single voter in any of the multi-parish constituencies, to suggest that we have 6 representatives is frankly wrong. I have 4 representatives, and that is the reality. That is the reality at the ballot box, and I do ask all members to consider that, and not these numbers, because these numbers, I think, do not represent the truth of the matter when people come to vote. Thank you, sir.
Talia.
That's only part of the story, though, isn't it? Because as a qualified advocate, and I'm sure somebody who's the Treasury Minister should be at least moderately numerate, she will know that there's another side of the coin, which is it's not about the number of representatives that you have, it's about the power of your vote to influence who you elect. And even the school children I talk to, I shouldn't say even the school children, of course, because they're very intelligent and they haven't yet discovered self-interest, is that they are quite capable of accepting that if 2 people have 1 vote each, or rather 2 districts have 1 vote each, but in one district there's only 1 person who can vote, and in the other district there are 100,000, clearly that's not equality. Now you can say, but it's perfectly fair. You've each got 1 representative, and you've each got 1 vote. Therefore, you're equally represented. You are equally represented in a sense, aren't you? But you certainly don't have the same influence that the person living in the 1-person district of the island has versus the people, the 100,000 living in the other district. And I can't see anyone trying to defend that. Now, of course, that is what some would call the argument to the extreme, sir. But it is something that we have to grapple with. And I consider it, just because we can't have the perfect system doesn't mean we can't have an improvement on what is being proposed. There is nothing sacred about the number 9, of course. And there are many in here who might, if they were voting in a self-interested way, want to punish St Helier for whatever reason and take a couple away from St Helier where they might otherwise have it, so that the countryside can be overrepresented, especially if your opposition party is coming from that particular area. But I would hope that nobody in this assembly would be thinking along those lines. We should actually be trying to set up fair systems. And I consider it a little bit like going to the optician. As long as I decide that I don't bite the bullet and get some kind of laser surgery, I'm going to need to either wear something like these to be able to see my good friends over there, even on the front row, grinning at the moment, Constable of Grouville and all of his good esteemed constable colleagues. I'll need these to be able to see them clearly, or wear a pair of contact lenses. Of course, I could bite the bullet and ultimately get the laser surgery, which some people tell me is actually very good. Once they've had it done, they don't look back and they get perfect 20/20 vision. But, sir, I've still got some reservations at the back of my mind. I'm not sure about this newfangled technology, and I'm a bit of a traditionalist when it comes to my eyewear apparel. So I'll either stick to ordinary spectacles for usual wear, or if I'm doing something particularly sporty, maybe put the temporary contact lenses in. But as for laser surgery, I don't like it and I don't want it, certainly at the moment, and I don't trust it, although I understand that others think it is very good. So when I go to the optician, I have to have the optician do this little game with me, which I find is great. Great value, by the way, the opticians, for the healthcare they provide, perhaps compared to some other healthcare. And they do this thing which is called better or worse. Better or worse. And there's a red and green game as well, which you can play. I wish they'd just changed the letters, of course, because you can usually remember 4 letters, so they should really change the slides a bit more often. And the fact that I have an astigmatism in one eye means that actually I can never get it quite right, especially if I'm going for contact lenses, because it's better to wear the same kind of contact lenses and accept that compromise, that I don't have to get them muddled up. And it doesn't make too much of a difference. It's not exactly mathematically perfect, but when I'm wearing my contact lenses, I make do, even though I know that other people, and when I have my glasses on, I can have much more perfect vision. So I'm willing to make those compromises in my own life when it comes to my own vision, and I get that. And so I think that's where we're at. I won't explain what the astigmatism metaphor is in terms of my eyes, and the ability to get this absolutely perfect in the metaphor for our democratic system, sir. But there are ways that we could certainly make our representation better. and there are ways in which we can make it worse. So I'd like members to perhaps stop thinking about how this might play out electorally in their districts and simply see the Constable of St Helier as the friendly optician who's bringing a few options to this Assembly with his amendment and saying better or worse. And I think we need to say invariably, whatever we think and whatever our policies are and our politics, is that the Constable's amendment here does make it objectively better for our representatives, and it's one that we should support. And it still gives good coverage, sir. It still gives 7 senators that magic biblical number of representation that we can have after this, of 7 members of the public representing the island on an island-wide basis alongside the mixed representation that we have, sir. And hopefully after that, we will have clear vision to lead, whoever it is, to lead the island into the next 10, 20, 30 years and focus on the real policies that matter to the island, but do it on a fairer basis, if not a perfect one.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Mezek.
Thank you, sir. Since we're going down the road of using metaphors, so I'm going to have a pizza with a friend of mine. So I slice that pizza in half. I then slice it into quarters. I'm going to leave 2 of those quarters intact, and the other 2 quarters, I'm going to slice each of those in half. So that side is now sliced into 4/8. I sit down with my friend to eat it. I decide I'm going to go for the 2 quarter slices. My friend decides they're going to go for the 4/8 slices. Who's had more pizza? Is it the person who's had 2 slices or the one who's had 4 slices? Well, the fact is they've had exactly the same amount of pizza, because it's not about the number of slices, it's about how much pizza you actually end up with. So that goes for how many votes you have. If you are one person voting in a constituency where there's 65,000 voters versus a constituency where there's 9,000 voters, the person voting in the constituency with the fewer number of voters has the more powerful vote. And that's how you determine voter equity, not by the number of votes you have, but by the proportion of voters to number of elected representatives. This is not rocket science, it's internationally recognised, and that's why, sir, you get the best practice guidance from places like the Venice Commission that tell you how to work out voter equity and present the formula for it. And it's really, really easy to apply to Jersey's system to work out what different changes in the systems achieve. And the Constable of St Helier has produced that table in his report, and it is clear and bang on easy to see that what he proposes will provide for greater voter equity from the constituency level representation in the Assembly, and the island-wide representation, that retains its perfection, so there's no distortion as a result of that. And he is, that is mathematically absolutely indisputable there. So, sir, given that the purpose of an election is to elect a parliament that is representative of the population, that's why the distribution of deputy seats has got to be done in such a way to address the malapportionment that is that's automatic as a result of the presence of the constables in the states. Now, so you could remove the constables from the states, and using the district system or different parish combinations, you could probably get much closer to perfection in voter equity. But the compromise that we have in the voting system is that we will have parish constables in the Assembly, and so the effort must be made with the distribution of deputy seats in order to counter that malapportion. And if you don't do so, you are gerrymandering by neglect. That is the simple fact of the matter. And when it was proposed, sir, to remove 1 deputy seat from each of the districts, the maths was not done at the time. The table that the constable has produced in his report, there was not an equivalent table in the original P2 proposition. Instead, so if I recall correctly, there was a line saying, oh, because we're doing it 1 from each district, that means there's no voter equity implications. And that was mathematically wrong and pointed out at the time. So, sir, if you care about voter equity and you care about maintaining as close to perfection as you can within the limits of our system, then this, as the constable proposes, is the best way to do it. But I will, sir, strongly disagree with a brief reference that was made by a previous speaker into this about there being allowed to be diversions from this principle for small jurisdictions. Sir, that is not for a single island with local boundaries where it's possible to have greater voter equity. It's only for situations where it's impossible, where you have a jurisdiction that, for example, might be an archipelago with lots of islands in it, and you simply can't clobber them together and able to do that. I can hear members behind saying it's not true, and they're absolutely wrong, and they should read the source material on that. It's for jurisdictions where you've got a mountain in. That means you can't get there. I will not give way, absolutely not. And this is what we get when it comes to debates on our election system. All of this nonsense gets thrown in to divert from having a proper conversation about equal votes for every one of our islanders who we represent. So that's why I support the Constable of St Heliers amendment.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment? Constable St Martin.
Thank you, sir. I must say that 7 instead of 9 senators seems very appealing to me, but nonetheless, and I fully appreciate that the Constable of St Helier is protecting his constituents, but I hope that he will appreciate that as the Constable of St Martin Grouville, who were left quite badly off with his proposition, that I need to protect mine. And we will end up with 2 deputies and 1 constable to be voted for. At the moment we have 3 deputies and 1 constable, and there is a discrepancy in this. It's only been mentioned once, so therefore I cannot support this, because I really feel I need to stand up for my own constituents. Thank you.
Thank you, Constable. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment? Deputy Rob Ward.
Thank you, sir. So I had put my lights on. I don't think it missed a moment. Just say that the table that was produced is about population numbers within those districts as they exist now. So they are accurate in terms of the representation. That's what the table says. Just read the table. I have to stand up and say, I mean, St Heliers Central will still be the most underrepresented district even after these changes. Which obviously I think is wrong. St Heliers South and St Heliers North will lose deputies and direct representation, and there is a concentrated population there. There's a significant local population that needs to be represented. We're lucky having the number of deputies we have because we can spread the workload, and there is a large workload there. There's a distinctly large workload in terms of constituency work in the urban populations and those concentrated populations. I'm lucky to have colleagues who help out so much, and we help each other out together, both in our districts and across the district, so that it will be felt. And I think if you're a St Helier deputy voting for senators to lose those deputies, I can only assume you're going to stand as senator, which is fine, you go for it, but I think that should be declared during this debate, because that's what you're going for, as the Constable had suggested. This does give a slightly more equity, and I think the numbers need to be looked at accurately. I think the best equity we had is the system we have now. We'd run it through once, we had a representation, we had the most representative electorate of the electorate in terms of diversity in the Assembly, which we're going to throw out, and we'll come back next time, and when that's gone we'll say, oh well, never mind, we have more people to vote for. It will be the same people who usually run in those areas and get it, and we will lose representation of the type which I think is representative of our population, which I think is a real shame. So I will be supporting the Constable in this, simply because it fixes a little. It gives a little bit more back in terms of St Helier, and it doesn't benefit me in my district in St Helier Central. It has no benefit to me, but it benefits other districts where, in St Helier North, where there, by the way, I have to say it, there are no Reform Jersey people there, so I'm backing other candidates. I think it's the right thing to do. Well, not yet anyway. And I think it's very important that we keep that representation for St Helier. There were 103,000 voters there. And it does not look good to encourage people to vote. I said this before and I'll say it again. So I hope we can at least support this to try and do something a bit better as we move forward in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment? Deputy Labby, then Deputy Renouf. Deputy Labby.
Thank you, sir. In the Constable's summing up, I would really appreciate him explaining these tables that he's produced on his page 3, because to my mind they are totally misleading. He has lumped constables in and miscalculated. For example, when he talks about St Mary, St Juan and St Peter, he's allocated 6 people. Well, those constituents cannot vote for 6 people. They cannot vote for 3 constables. They can vote for, and likewise, the constituency of St John, St Lawrence, he's calling that 6 votes per constituent, which is totally and utterly misleading. And if you take those figures and recalculate them as they should be, so I would suggest the best way of doing that is to remove the constables, because they will obscure the votes anyway. If you remove the constables from that equation, as it's deputies that we're actually talking about in this part of the debate, for example, my own constituency, you end up with 2 deputies representing 4,674 people each. St Helier St Helier South, for example, if you remove the 0.33 as he's allocated for himself, and calculate it on the 4 deputies, the 3, you come out with a far lesser figure, in fact, almost half to what we represent in Grouville and St Martin. So in his summing up, I'd really appreciate the Constable explaining his figures and how he arrived at this. And to my mind, it's a lot of things, but it most certainly is not equitable.
Thank you, Deputy.
So, can I just ask a point of clarification in that regards numbers?
Will you accept a point of clarification, Deputy Labby, or not? Will you accept a point of clarification, Deputy Labby? Will you accept a point of clarification from Deputy Ward?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Deputy
I
Ward.
think so. It's just, none of us, and I would not suggest in the slightest that the Deputy would mislead the Assembly. I know her very well, and I know that would not happen, so I'm not doing that, and I want to make that really clear. It's just if you take the number from St Helier South, 3,358, and divide it by 3.33, you get, 11,000, you get 3,358. If you take the 0.3 off, you get a larger number, which is 3,727. So the situation gets worse, not better. Thanks.
Sorry, sir, can I just add, there's actually that number is incorrect?
No, we're not being debate about. It's a point of clarification.
I just want to understand that's understood, because if you're going to quote numbers in the Assembly,
I think you've made your point.
they need to be correct.
Respond to that?
Also.
Do you want to respond to that point of clarification? On the maths?
Well, I don't consider that the people of St Helier South or St Helier or anything can vote for a 0.33 of a constable. Equally, I do not accept the people of, I do not accept the people of St Mary, St Juan, St Peter, St John's, St Lawrence and Trinity can vote for 3 constables. So the figures are completely obscured.
Thank you. Deputy Renouf.
So the greatest negative effect of the proposal that was voted on in the beginning in March was the extreme disadvantaging of 2 electoral districts, which are way outside the Venice Electoral Commission guidelines. And I think that should be a matter of great concern. And I think this amendment has the effect of correcting the very worst effects of P2. It does seem concerning to me, I'll say, along the way, that people seem to want to find reasons not to follow best practice as represented by the Venice Commission, when I think we should want to be the best we can in that regard. I think we had the embarrassing situation in the last vote in March when it became clear that Deputy Miller didn't actually realise that her proposal significantly increased unfairness in the electoral system. Her report said, we can retain the current more equal electoral districts for deputies, retain the Conotabs and reinstate the senators. Under this arrangement, the voting system would maintain its existing level of equity. She apologised for that, but I do think it is indicative of the lack of thought that went into bringing this. There was a casualness. And I think this amendment goes some way to correcting the problems that arose out of that casualness. As I say, I think we should all be deeply concerned about the issue of voter equity. We all do like to talk the talk when it comes to increasing turnout, but when it comes to making decisions, we tend to put it to one side. And I think a distorted electoral system is very hard to defend when people say, well, our votes don't count. And you say, well, yes, suddenly they don't really count as much as some other votes. We've built that into our system. It has been said that we cannot solve malapportionment, and that is true. We can't completely solve it, but we can make it better. That is all this amendment does. It doesn't attempt to change the entire electoral system. It doesn't attempt to correct lots of other things that could have been corrected. It just does one thing. It just shifts the balance back to a slightly greater representation for St Helier, and that is making the system slightly more equal. The question of the exact figures and whether you include constables, you can't take constables out of the calculation. That is the main cause of distortion in the electoral system. How you calculate them in the system can be done in different ways, but there is no question that the fundamental point at stake is that those two St Helier districts are much more underrepresented than they would be if this amendment were passed. And that corrects a deficiency, the most egregious deficiency. It doesn't make the system perfect, as I say. And I do think we should tackle this question of the number, voter equity being equivalent to the number of votes you cast. Because it is not. And every time we say it, and every time we talk about this question of, I don't have as many votes as somebody, we perpetuate something which we really shouldn't as responsible lawmakers. The people in Grouville and St Martin are not less advantaged because they have fewer votes. Their votes, their representatives are shared between, have smaller constituencies, and therefore their voting power is retained. And under the constable's table, in fact, are slightly above the voting power of members in my district. My district is slightly marginally disadvantaged, as Deputy Scott said, but it still falls well within the Venice Commission guidelines, and you know what, I can live with that. So, as I say, I think you can quibble about the exact figures, but...
There's a point of clarification, Deputy Scott. Will you accept a point of clarification? Give way for that, or at the end?
I'll wait until the end, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Yes, thrown me off my my point. So actually, I'll take it now and then maybe pick up the thread.
Deputy Scott?
Reserving that this may not be the end of my speech.
No, of course, we understand.
No, I apologise. I didn't mean to throw the deputy off the speech, but it's just because the premise of his speech is that this is better in terms of representation than otherwise, and Deputy Labbe has looked at figures that exclude constables, when I was actually looking at figures that... No, I was trying to ask about the basis of the calculation of figures on which
he's given Deputy Reynolds a way, and the purpose of interruption can only be in order to ask him to explain any part of his speech, or for you to elucidate something that you've said in your speech. It's not a chance to make another speech. Do you follow?
Sir, this is still a point of clarification, or should I have asked for something else?
Well, a point of clarification, we've got to limit, the purpose of clarification
Right.
is limited by standing order.
Then
on
I
item
would like
1.
clarification of the basis on which he has been suggesting that that this is better, whether he's including constables or not as a fraction or not.
Yes.
Yes, I think I made clear that I was using the table provided by the constable, and I also said that I think the argument that you could remove the constables from the table is, if you consider the constable's table to be flawed, is even more flawed, because that is the source of the distortions within the electoral system. The deputy system is designed to try and correct for those. It is impossible to produce a table of global apportionment given 3 different categories of members across 3 different electoral districts. You have to pick one, and this one is one. I think it's probably the best. But under any system that you did, you would still find that putting putting seats back into St Helier would be fairer than the current system as proposed under P2, largely because, of course, of the excessive bias against the system, because the Constable of St Helier represents so many voters compared to other districts. But the point about the P2 was that it casually took one member from each of the 9 districts and reapportioned them without realising that doing so would have a greater negative effect on the parishes of St Helier, particularly the districts in St Helier. This corrects substantially for that, and I think therefore it should be supported. The fact that it reduces from 9 to 7 doesn't seem to me to be a huge issue. We had 6 in the past, we've had 12, 7, 9. It doesn't seem to me to make a huge amount of difference. It might make hustings slightly easier, who knows. So I think, as I say, on the basis that it corrects the single biggest flaw in the original proposition, I shall support.
Thank you, Deputy. Constable St John.
Thank you, sir. I didn't expect to be quoting Mark Twain this afternoon, but there are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Sir, I could also say, be careful what you wish for. The current system wasn't just thrown together, sir. The current system was brought forward after lots of discussion, lots of hard work by lots of different people, sir, to try and get as fair and equitable districts as possible, notwithstanding the retention of constables with its own quirks. So I think what the Constable of St Helier has tried to do is mix constituencies. So I represent the constituency of the parish of St John. My colleague from St Lawrence represents the parish of St Lawrence, and my colleague behind represents Trinity. What my good friend the Constable of St Helier has done is put us all together in the district, one of the 9 districts, and I think that is where things get confusing. But it hasn't changed, sir. That was the result of taking 9 deputies, 1 from each district. It's very simple, sir, but you need to be careful of the consequences. And if you're going to go back to your districts tonight or tomorrow night and say, we've got senators, but we've lost a deputy here and there, be careful what you wish for, sir. The effort that was put into the existing system was significant, sir, and I think if we're going to make a change, it needs to be as fair as possible. And I think people may be upset about that, sir. If they've got aspirations to be one of the 9, they may be now becoming one of the 7, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Constable. Deputy Morell.
Thank you, sir. Don't know if I'm going to contribute greatly. It was more to pick up on a couple of points, sir. One of them was in Deputy Renouf's speech, where, in many ways, quite rightly, he talked about voter equity and what it really is. And he wasn't wrong in what he said. But that's part of the problem, is by reducing the statistics or by reducing this subject matter to statistics, I think the last assembly, in making the changes to the system we currently have, fundamentally misunderstood the feelings of people and, most importantly, the perception of the electorate. So Deputy Renouf and others may be entirely correct in pointing to the 0.3s and the 3s and the whatever, the numbers, and being able to say, well, this is a fairer, equal system. I said that. What was totally misunderstood was that people would feel like they have less of a vote. And that goes to Deputy Miller's point earlier, was that they literally counted the number of votes they had. And under the senatorial system, they had effectively, it was 8 at the last count, and so somebody in St Lawrence, in the old system, had 2 deputies, 1 constable, and 8 senators they could vote for. So they felt like they had 11 votes. And suddenly, in this new system, somebody in St Lawrence, as Deputy Miller quite rightly pointed out, had 4 votes. And so it was that feeling of a theft of votes that really struck a chord with the population when I've spoken to them. And you could sit there and quote the statistics about equity and saying how this is now a fairer system as much as you liked. They felt like they'd had votes stolen from them. And in the case of my district, they felt like they'd had 7 votes stolen from them, which was significant because that was a lot more than the number they felt they'd had stolen was a lot more than the number they now had. They went from 11 to 4. So they'd lost more than they were currently keeping. And that, to me, is the fundamental problem here. And, you know, it is one of the problems in democracy is that sometimes you can do your analysis, you can do your statistics, you can prove that on paper this all works, this is a much better, fairer system. But if the person at the end of if the person in the street at the end of the day feels like they are now losing something or they are in a worse situation than they were before, then they will feel cheated. And it doesn't matter how many statistics you quote of them. It really doesn't. And that, I think, is the issue we have here today. It is the sense of having had 11 votes, they've now got 4 votes. That is unfair from their perspective. And that's what I think this, the main proposition, not Deputy Crowcross' proposition, but Constable St Heliers' proposition, the main proposition seeks to get at is that for a population to feel like they are represented properly, they themselves have to feel that that representation is fair to them. They had a system, they had 11, 12 votes, whatever it may be, depending where you are in the island. Now they've just got a handful of votes, 4 or 5 votes at most. That's what made the population, at least in my district, in my constituency, that's what upset them and made them feel so angry. And that's what I wish to restore to them, is that sense of feeling that it is a fair system, because now they have, like you say, they can vote potentially for 11 representatives in this assembly. They suddenly felt like they were just voting for 4 representatives. So they were then, in their minds, fundamentally underrepresented from what they had before. And that, to me, I think, gets to the heart of this misunderstanding. And to be honest, it's something which is one of the issues with democracy, is we can do all the workings out and realise on our desktops that this new system is a better system, it's fairer, etc. But if you leave people feeling cheated, they will react. And so I wanted to make that point most keenly. And it was just to Deputy Mezek's point, and, you know, because I was one of the people saying I think that's wrong. And the reason I thought it was wrong is because in the Venice Commission, it says that, and I just need to find it again, sir, the geographical criterion and administrative or possibly even historical boundaries may be taken into, and it was the historical part, but it was the historical part, which meant to me it wasn't just about geography, it was about history as well. And this is as much about history as it is about the geography of parish boundaries. And so that's why I felt I was right. And I have no problem. I will not say that Deputy Mezek is wrong. I say we interpret the same thing differently. And I think that will be fine. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Gardner.
Thank you, sir. And I would like to encourage Deputy Morrell to think through the feeling that he raised. Because the numbers, we need to find this way. It's not perfect, right? We know. And obviously we know that St Helier North is very different from St Helier South. And until this vote, I personally voted to take senators out. up till the last vote, because I did have constituency surgery. There are a couple constituencies that wanted to keep system as it is. Most of my constituents, their feeling was to restore senators. Saying this, the equity of the vote is important. Now, if we are talking about 11 votes, and this is what Deputy Ranov said, the gap is substantial, and the Connotab of St. Lawrence also said we might need to consider 7 and not 9. I don't have any problem with the 7 personally, because I believe, you know what, we need to explore. We did have a proposition before we voted out, but I cannot see how 9 is better than 7. But if you are coming, your feeling, if the Deputy Morel thinking about feelings of his constituencies, plus the numbers, simple calculation, you have 7 senators, you have 3 deputies, and 1 constable. You're still going back to 11 votes the constituent will have. So from one side, the constituency will have more votes, and in most places it will be between 10 to 11 votes that they will have to cast, and you are not keeping St. Helier North 40, maybe 30%, we don't catch on the now, but it's substantial misrepresentation for the St. Helier North and the vote that the representatives from St. Helier North will carry. So I do believe that 7, it can be actually really, really good way in the middle when you have the same amount of votes that previous people had in their constituency, and at the same time we are not perfect, but getting this equity back.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment? Chief Minister.
Very quickly, sir, just to follow up the argument about voter equity versus voter influence, and I think that the Constable of St. Lawrence was right. I've been working on this for 20 years. If you're going to stick to the parish boundaries or utilise the parish boundaries in any form of constituency, you're never going to get that voter equity that we all strive for, that what we class as perfection. Equally, and I haven't got my spreadsheets with me, actually. I didn't think I'd need them. I wish I'd bought them, but the constable's figures they change things significantly. If you know, I have 4 votes, not 6 in my parish. The constituents in St. Helier, they have 4 or 5 votes, depending on how many, because they all vote for a constable. Interestingly, I wonder what the figures would do if we actually based the population figures on the people that voted, because if you equate that to the number of people that turned out, it would probably be the fewer people that turned out in St. Helier. I'm not sure if it's relevant, but they have greater power than most of the other parishes, just the relation to vote to members, to the number of people that turn out. So no matter how much we debate it, we're never going to find that magic formula that matches us all up, so we're all equity. But it is, I've noticed the biggest comment I've had from parishioners or constituency members is they feel a disconnect from the assembly because they're voting for far fewer members. If you look at the numbers, they're relevant to us, but in the terms of when you look at the voter equity in larger countries and cities, where the percentage might be very close, but there might be thousands of numbers of variance to the population in it. We vote from roughly, the population variance is between 2,000 to 3,500 per member. So it's relevant to our small community, but they're not vast numbers. I would argue that they don't make a lot of difference in this assembly. So I support. I mean, I feel like we're in a TV quiz show. Do we stick and stay with the safe 7, or do we go for the jackpot and go for 9? I don't really know. But what I do know is that this assembly made a decision in May. We're now here to put the legislation around that decision. But it's going to be an interesting one for members there. So I say, in the case of our small island, voter influence is more important to islanders than looking for that magic number of voter equity, because even with greater voter influence, the voter equity isn't hugely different in relation to the number of people in this assembly, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Feltham.
Thank you, sir. I was moved to speak because I was so disappointed to hear the Chief Minister suggest that perhaps the number of representatives should be thought about in terms of the number of people that actually vote. You don't encourage people that feel disenfranchised and don't vote because they think that their vote doesn't matter and won't make a difference by disenfranchising them further. And I'd like the Chief Minister to rethink those thoughts that he had. Also, the comments around voter influence compared to voter equity. Well, that's the point. Voter equity means that there is equitable influence across this States Assembly per voter, and that is really important. I am disappointed with the decisions that the States has made to further reduce our voter equity, particularly for our most populated areas of St Helier and I think St Saviour are most affected. And the Constable's amendment does go some way to remedy that. But still, and I will support this amendment, but still even with this amendment, we are taking a great step backwards in terms of voter equity. And I worry about what that says to our most populated areas around what this Assembly thinks about the people that live in those areas compared to the people that live in the country parishes. And I have been quite disturbed to hear some of the comments that have been made today in this debate, because I think we'd come so far in relation to our understanding of voter equity and how it's about each voter having an equal say about an equal representation in this Assembly. The number of votes that somebody casts does not impact on that equal representation. The figures that are in the Constable's amendment do demonstrate that. The figures that we've looked at before, and I'm reminded of all of the work that was done in the previous Assembly, and contrary to what Deputy Morrell said, those figures do matter. And actually what us taking notice of those figures, that matters as well. It matters to those people that we're saying we're going to disenfranchise further, and I hope that it doesn't have a further negative impact on voter turnout, particularly in our more populated parishes.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Balash.
So this morning, the Constable of St John was talking about the referendum in 2013 and rightly lamenting the atrocious decision of this Assembly not to implement the decision made by the people. But it's worth recalling, I think, that what people were voting on in 2013 was a proposal for 6 electoral districts, where not only were the number of representatives per district more or less the same, but the number of representatives for whom each voter could vote was also the same. What Deputy Miller did in her proposition relating to the reintroduction of senators was to preserve the voter equity in terms of the number of people, the number of people for whom each voter could vote, but to diminish the equity of representation in terms of the number of representatives represented by each member. And that was a pity, I think, but it's a reflection of legislating on constitutional matters on the hoof and not giving proper consideration to all the implications of changes which are being contemplated. The Constable of St Helier's proposition may conceivably make the voter representation a little better, but he does so at the cost of making much, much worse the voter equity, as explained so well by the Deputy L'Abbé of Grouville. Representative Grouville and St Martin will be reduced to 2 representatives, whereas a constituency in St Helier will have 4 representatives. That is outrageous. Why should people in Grouville and St Martin only be able to have 2 representatives when those in St Helier have 4? There is no justification for it. And so I think this amendment of the Constable of St Helier is misconceived, and members ought to vote against it.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Doublé.
Thank you, sir. I'm just digesting the previous speech, which I may respond to. And I think the simple answer to the Deputy's final question there was that there is a far greater number of voters in St Helier. That's something that seems clear to me. And I'm grateful to the Constable of St Helier for putting those numbers very clearly in his report. And I am going to support this amendment. I'm going to vote for it because I'm going to follow the evidence on this one, and I'm going to stick with my principles and the basic principle of having a high quality, more democratic assembly means that I will vote for this. And I think members who supported the change back to senators, and I do understand some of the reasons why and the appeal behind the island-wide vote. I think this is a compromise. So it was a very close vote, and I think there may have been members that were still unsure, even though they supported it. And I think that this does present us with a compromise, as Deputy Tadea said earlier in the debate, to make it less bad. And in that sense, I will be supporting it.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment? Deputy Goulds.
So I don't really have too much to add, but the deputies of, I think we like to think of ourselves as District 1, but perhaps I'll say we're from St Juan, St Mary and St Peter. And the relevant constable, that's only one constable, not the other 2, received a message from a parishioner this morning. This is a parishioner who I think, as I'm right in thinking, has sat on the statistics board that used to oversee the work of Statistics Jersey. He's had a number of conversations with the chief statistician. He sent us some tables. I'm not going to try and decipher all of those tables, although I'm reminded in looking at them that we remind ourselves, those members who have been praising the new system, that the turnout was not improved. In fact, if memory serves, it was slightly down. At best, it was the same. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I think one of the reasons was for all of the reasons that those members have spoken about, that islanders felt that they'd had votes removed from them, and they felt to some extent disenfranchised. This constituent or parishioner goes on and makes a number of points about why there might be low voter turnout at the election, which I won't go into. But he simply, in his final sentence, which is, I think, worth repeating, he simply says vote more senators, not less. Thank you.
Deputy Luce.
Thank you, sir. And I can't help but stand and support Constable St Martin. Deputy Labby, I'm really concerned, sir, that the constables' numbers and tables are misleading. There's no question in my mind that Grewville and St Martin are one constituency. But when it comes to the representatives that parishioners in those two parishes have, they do not have 4, they have 3 in this new system proposed here in the first table by the constable. The constable of Grewville does not represent people who live in St Martin. That to me is very clear. These numbers are misleading, sir, and I really, really implore the constable of St Helier to withdraw this table. If you apply the correct division to it, Grewville and St Martin ends up at 3,116 population per representative, and when you apply that to the St Helier districts, that number in Grewville and St Martin's is the highest of any of these 9 constituencies. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else want to speak on this amendment? Deputy Tom Binney.
Yes, sir. I have to ask members to forgive me if this is all too complicated for me. I did withdraw from the education system very early, but I feel like I'm looking at a king with no clothes on, and I seem to be one of the only people that can see it. And perhaps the constable could explain to me in his summing up, and genuinely forgive me if I've got this wrong, but in the old days, and I had thought that senators were representatives, and perhaps they don't appear to be, because in the constable's table, he only shows 40 positions. I've heard a lot today about voter equity, but surely if we really wanted voter equity, and to say that this is where I need to be corrected, surely we'd have 37 senators, would we not? Because I would have thought that senators are representative, and not only are the constables not being calculated properly here, but we don't have a column showing us the effective representation of either having 7 or 9 senators. Now, it strikes me as if proper voter equity is 37 senators, every time you reduce a senator and divide it down into deputies, you reduce voter equity. Now, there might come a point at which that goes the other way, but it would have been very, very helpful if the constable wanted to make a good point, to A, have got the constables right, and B, have included the 9 senators or 7 senators to show us what the real representation is. Because as I say, I've lived a long time with senators, and when we were building a business, I used to rely on them quite heavily. And I found that they were representatives. They weren't pretend or anonymous. They were there and they were representatives. So perhaps the constable can tell me why he hasn't included those numbers in his chart. So thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Alves.
Thank you, sir. And I won't go into the detail of the numbers because, quite frankly, sir, it depresses me that we're having this debate, especially when I spent hours, days of my life to get to the proposals that we settled on in last term. However, I do take issue with a comment that Deputy Gorst made, where he said that he believed the reason why our voter turnout was slightly down was due to the loss of the island-wide senator role. So I'd like to draw members once again, like I did in the original debate on this, to the results of the JOLS survey, the 2022 survey that was done immediately after the last election. On page 21, there is a very clear graph, bar chart, which shows people's reasons why they did not vote. Sir, the loss of the island-wide senator role was at the bottom of those reasons with 3%. The top 3 was, wouldn't make a difference at 30%, don't trust the political system at 28%, not interested in the elections at 24%, and didn't know enough about the candidates at 22%. So, sir, I think members should really think very carefully about the real reasons why people are not coming out to vote, and that actually voting against this amendment will not encourage people. It will actually do the opposite. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment? I call upon the Conotard.
Thank you, sir. I clearly have a bit of work to do. We've been into a pizza restaurant, we've been into the opticians, and quite a lot of members have gone down a rabbit hole. I will do what I can to explain the purpose of this amendment. Deputy Balash said it was an outrageous amendment, and he asked the question. He said, why should people in St Martin and Greville have fewer members of Parliament, fewer members in this Assembly? The answer is because there are fewer of them. There are not so many people living in that district, so they have fewer representatives. And this was the point that Deputy Messick was trying to make with his pizza analogy. Perhaps I could make it even simpler. Let's imagine two districts, two electoral districts. District A has 1,000 voters in it, and they have 10 seats in the elected Parliament or the Assembly. District B, they can vote for 10, each member can vote for 10 people. District B has 10,000 members, 10,000 voters, 10,000 population. They can vote for 10 seats in the Assembly. Happy days. All these people can vote for the same number of representatives. But hang about, is that fair? Is that the basis of how we organise parliamentary democracy? I think if you tried to do that in the United Kingdom or in France or America, there would be a revolution. And if I can put it really simply, the whole basis of representative democracy is that electoral districts are arranged according to population. They're not arranged according to how many people turn out to vote. And that's a ludicrous idea, as has been pointed out by some of the speakers. They're arranged by population. And that's why St Helier has more members in it than Greville, St Martin, or wherever, because there's more people living there. And if you take away representatives from the most populous district, even if you put in 9 senators, to answer Deputy Tombinet, the senators aren't here because they don't make any difference. Everybody can vote for the 9 senators or the 7 senators, so that's not a problem. They don't need to be in their calculations. But if you take out electoral representatives from the town and you leave them in the countryside, then how are people going to feel in town? There was quite a few misunderstandings. I think misunderstanding is in a lot of my comments. But just to go through, I'm grateful to Deputy Ahier for pointing out the PPC position, which is that this amendment makes the situation slightly less inequitable than it will be if it is not approved. Deputy Miller started off the argument, which got increasingly loud as the debate went on, that it's all about how many people you can vote for. And I go back to my 2 districts, A and B. They can both vote for the same number of districts, but one has 10 times more people in it than the other one. And that's why it's not fair. That's why there is more political power in District A than in District B. Yes, I've referred to the opticians and the pizza restaurant. I'm just trying to see who else I need to pick up. I do accept Deputy Ward's point that the central district of St Helier remains slightly worse off, even though amazingly it has five deputies. One member, I think it was Constable St John, talked about going back to the parish this evening to announce that they're losing some deputies. If you look at my 2 tables, there's no difference in the number of deputies. You're not losing any deputies. What you're actually doing is taking 2 senatorial seats and trying to redress the balance in the town. So that's a misunderstanding. I think the Constable of St Martin realises that her area will not be, as she says, quite badly off. It will still be slightly overrepresented when it comes to the political power of those people who vote. Deputy Morell talked about statistics, and there was a view from several members that there's something wrong with the tables. These tables were compiled by better minds than mine. They've been checked by the Gref. They are absolutely accurate. And I say in my report that for the purposes of this amendment, I've included the constables and the deputies together. And my report says, yes, I accept that there's a difference between a constable and deputy, don't I know it? And you can't, of course, vote for 3 constables if you live in one of the bigger parishes, the super constituencies. But when it comes to the power of the ballot box over the policies of this assembly, and that's what really matters, it's not how many people you can vote for, it's how much power the people you vote for actually are going to wield in this assembly. I just think if there's anyone else I need to answer. I'm very grateful to both Deputy Feltham and Deputy Alves. Poor Deputy Alves says she's depressed, probably I've got a pillow over her head at the moment at home. The amount of work she has done, and with her fine brain, she absolutely gets it. And I think there's a minority of members who understand parliamentary democracy. That's a slightly depressing thing to be saying in an assembly, because judging by the speeches I've heard, there's some very, really quite intelligent members of this assembly who really don't get it. And I wish I could invite Abraham Lincoln in here and ask him just to explain to the assembly, well, what do we mean by fair representation, or any other of the giants of history. So I may not have, my report may simply be a bit thin. I perhaps should have explained in more detail why it really matters that where you have more population, you have more members of parliament. But I kind of thought that was obvious. I'm concerned if this amendment doesn't go through, that we will be taken to task as a jurisdiction once these figures become widely known, because they are pretty bad. And as Deputy Messick said, we didn't have them in front of us when we voted on Deputy Millar's original proposition. And that was something I regret. And in closing, I will say, sir, that if this amendment is lost and P56 goes through unamended, then I feel, because it was such a close vote, I only have myself to blame. I maintain the amendment.
The appel called for? Appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. This too is a vote which requires 25 members in order to be adopted. I invite the greffier to open the voting. All members the opportunity of casting their votes. I ask the greffier to close the voting. That's including the online votes. The outcome of the vote is pour 24, contra 21, abstention 1. Accordingly, the amendment has not been adopted.
Can we have the abstention, please?
The Conetable St Martin abstained.
Yes.
Those members voting for the Conetable St Helier, St Lawrence, St John and St Clement and Deputies Southern, Tadier, Lehegra, Ayer, Rob Ward, Gardner, Mesick, War, Renouf, Catherine Curtis, Eltham, Jern, Kovac, Wilson, Stevenson, Andrews, Coles, Owls, Doublé and Porre. And those members voting contre, the Connétable, St Bernard, Trinity, St Peter, Grouville, St Juan, St Mary and St Saviour, and Deputies Labby, Luce, Morel, Gorst, Farnham, Balash, Miles, Gott, Rose Binet, Miller, Howe, Tom Binet, Ferry and Barbara Ward.
The next matter is the amendment lodged by the Committee des Connétables. I'll ask the greffier to read the amendment. Sorry, the next one is the amendment of Deputy Tadier. I'll ask the greffier to read the amendment. Chairman. Yes, are you content to accept your amendment, take your amendment as read, Deputy Tadier? It's a lengthy amendment, 3.5 pages long.
Yes, sorry, I'll stand up if I need to.
Very much. Deputy will propose his amendment.
Thank you, sir. I wasn't expecting to be called just now, so I had been trying to prepare an infographic for members just to explain the timeline about what an election would look like. But I'll be happy to explain that, and maybe I know the Gref does have something which is in an Excel format if that information is required. But I think that's perhaps key to weighing up this decision. I think we've got a bit more certainty about how things are looking for the next election, which I think is welcome, even if we've been on maybe different sides of the argument up until now. I reiterate the position that I'm still open-minded to bringing senators back, and that senators, I think, could well play a more permanent part in future elections and be a mainstay, but I think it will always be open to evolution and perhaps to other roles changing in the future. I simply preface that by saying I would also expect, that the deputies' roles may change if senators continue. I say that really to preface what I'm talking about, because this is really focusing on the distinctions in the rules, or at least the idea that if we are going to have different positions in this assembly, which we will have, I think, if this all goes through, we will move from having 2 types of member to 3 types of member. There is, of course, a lot being said that we're all the same, but we can't all be, I say we, I'm not presuming to be here, so when I talk about we, I'm talking about this assembly rather than presuming that any of us will be part of that, so let that be understood in the future. Is that there must be some distinction, of course, so we wouldn't be bringing back senators if they didn't have a slightly different role to play socially and politically in democratic life. Otherwise, we would just stick with what we've got, or even seek to just have one type of states member. So there must be at least a slight difference in senators and deputies. And the difference will be, I think, and this is what the public who want senators to come back seem to be saying to us, is that we expect to be able to vote for a certain number of people on an island-wide basis. And we expect that those those candidates who get elected will, for some part, take high office, and that we would certainly expect that the Chief Minister comes from those 9 senators. This is, by the way, none of this is necessarily what I believe, but these, I think, are the consensus messages that we get from the electorate. There's also a strong message out there which says, not universally, but we expect the senators who come forward and are successful to have some degree of political experience already. So whilst we as an electorate might make the occasional exception, and we might vote for somebody who particularly impresses us at the ballot box, we will by and large, and the evidence has proven it over the years, be going for members who have either served as deputy or constable, or perhaps have served previously and are coming back after a break. That's what history tells us. So with that in mind, we have to question, what are the benefits of having different election periods and different election days, given the fact that since the introduction of senators in 1948, for the most part of that, the vast majority of that time, there were separate election periods. And the way it worked is that islanders would first vote for their senators, whatever the number was, it used to be 12, We know it's been reduced. And they would do that on the basis that the senators were somehow the senior members of the Assembly. And of course they were senior in that sense because they were, a lot of them were former jurats, when it was certainly replacing the jurats role. But over time it became seen as a senior position and the one from which the heads of your major committees would be elected. And there is still that expectation, I think, today that the top job will come from a senator. I think it's still inconceivable, although there's no reason democratically that it couldn't happen, that our next chief minister, the Jersey's next chief minister, will be a senator. I'd take odds on that, and I wouldn't bet against it, sir. So with that in mind, I then moved to the question about where all the electoral focus is going to be, and also where the media focus and attention is going to be, and including the electorate's focus. I think we live in an age where we're constantly getting bombarded, much more than we used to in the past. I've had some great conversations with some members of the estates about how this estates and others outside about how elections used to be. And we can't, unfortunately, in some ways, go back to the days of the horse and carts when you would go around with a bandstand and that there would be an accordion band on the back of the cart and you'd go around the parish or you go around the island if you're running for senator. And it would be a bit of a party atmosphere, and then on election night there'd be a great party back for those who were successful at getting elected. It's a much more subdued atmosphere, but it's a much more intense election period, isn't it? Those of us who have done it know that those 5 or indeed 6 weeks, which is currently being proposed, I find the election period is one we need to get back to, because I think it's currently what's being proposed for the single election day feels instinctively too long. Feels like there could be a lot of election fatigue, especially for candidates. And that will be a very busy period because candidates will not only have to be out there putting up posters if they want to, putting up banners, getting them ready before, preparing their information, knocking on doors, if indeed that is the way that they're going to campaign, responding to social media in the various forms, but also being scrutinised on social media, having to respond to journalists' questions, deadlines from the state's GREF. It's going to be difficult enough for the candidates, let alone the public, to be able to keep up with that one big election that's going on, the important one for 9 seats, let alone to have to keep up with what's going on in their districts, which could be the supra-parish districts, as Deputy Mezek said, or internally for the constables' elections. And remember, they will all be contested one way or the other. Gone are the days where constables don't have to face an election. They definitely have to put a manifesto out nowadays. They can't sit back on nomination day knowing that nobody else has come forward and that it's a done and dusted deal. They will still have to go to their electorate. They will still have to put their ideas out there. And what I'm suggesting will happen as an unintended consequence of going back to the 3 different positions is that human nature and media nature will be that all of the interest and focus will be on those 9 senatorial seats. Who's going to go for the top position? Where are the interesting debates going to be held? Who are the new faces that are coming out for senator? Who are the old guard that are perhaps seeking a promotion and to take that top job? And who will he or she choose for his ministerial team? And there'll be very little scrutiny going on for what's happening with deputies and constables. And they should be distinct periods, I would say. So I think there is merit in having those 2 distinct election periods. One of the counter-arguments that I've heard, and I must say I was really disappointed with a media interview that I gave in good faith, because I thought I was asked a multitude of questions, all of which related to some of the advantages, and I was put a couple of questions which I addressed. And the overriding headline that the journalists seemed to want to go with, TV journalists, was that, oh, it's going to cost a lot of money and that we're going to have 2 elections and it's going to cost this amount of money, completely not focusing on any of the potential benefits that I'm seeking to outline here. And of course, yeah, there is a trade-off. We're going to hear perhaps from the parishes that it's going to be difficult to run 2 election days at the weekend. I don't want to belittle that in any way, but I would say that it's been the case in the past that there have been 2 election days, and albeit that they were in the week, I think there is a trade-off. I think there will be, if the parishes want to be brave and actually put a call out for volunteers. I think we know that there's a whole multitude of people who will volunteer in Jersey to come out and be counters to help administer elections, sir. But I do accept that it will mean that there's an extra election period and an extra cost involved with that. But I would say that I think it's money that is well spent and that you can't put a price on democracy. The other counter-argument we hear is really one of a knee-jerk one, and it's one that plays to the increasing stereotype that all States members are useless. When I heard the Joel survey being quoted by Deputy Alves there for reasons why people don't vote, there was a kind of an unwritten one that was at the top. It's because we all think you're a bunch of triple X's or whatever, and that's the mentality has got out there that we're all the same, that we're all useless, we're all self-serving, and that, you know, and that's not just because of what goes on in Jersey. I think it's because that's the way politicians are being perceived around the world. And it's a lot, of course, we know that a lot of that is completely unfair. And so there is a general mood that, of course, on the other side of the coin is why would anybody put themselves forward for election? Because we know that it is, in Jersey especially, it's a goldfish bowl. We know that all of your behaviour is scrutinised. We found that out very recently. And that goes for even the minutiae of what we say and what we do, even quite innocently. And so the argument that comes back, oh, well, isn't this just another opportunity for failed candidates to have two bites of the cherry? I would say, so what with that argument? And I used this argument in the last debate, and I've probably slightly honed it for a recent letter to the Jersey Evening Post in which I compared this to a recruitment process, right? Now, I know we can't compare being a States member with working in any other job. I think we've proved that so far. But let me give the example, is that if you were recruiting in a company and you wanted to recruit a number of positions, and one of the key positions that you need to fill first, because it's the most important vacancy you have, let's say it's the Director of Operations, you will have a number of people come forward with hopefully the relevant experience, but you can only choose one person for that role. And so you have that election, you don't have that election period, we will have the election, but they have a recruitment process, shortlisting process, and you choose one person. But of course there are other positions to fill. You still need to get a head of marketing and you need to get a head of HR for your company because there are vacancies. So there are two options there. You can either say to the very good candidates who just missed out, by the way, we're having another round of recruitment in 2 weeks. Will you come back for that? Because we've kept your CVs. We think you make an excellent candidate. We can't promise you the job. We've got other people to see who didn't apply for the first position. But please consider putting your name forward for that role. And if you're successful, you can get it. Now, that's what would normally happen in a company. You wouldn't have a presumption in that company. If your head of HR says, oh, no, sorry, we can't have any failed candidates. Can't have any failed job candidates because you say, but okay, you sure? Because I've got experience to do that role. And, you know, you said I just missed out by that role by a very narrow margin and I was a very good candidate. No, sorry, we can't do that. We're having all of our recruitment processes on the same day. Complete nonsense. You wouldn't ensure that you would get the best person for the job. So what happens if the best person for the job is a failed candidate for another job? I think we're actually depriving our electorate of that choice. And certainly when we had the senatorial meetings in St. Brelard, of course it was attended by, it wasn't well attended, but it was attended by mostly by people who wanted to see a return of the senators. And I did put the question to people, how would you feel about different election days? They said, yeah, we think that would probably work. And they said, we strongly feel that any senators should previously have served as a States member. And we had a bit of back and forth and said, well, you know, there is an issue here because there are long-standing States members here. I can think of lots of deputies or constables who I think would do very well as senator. You know, I think we've got a mother and father of this House at the moment who I think are respectively, I don't want to get them confused, but certainly the mother of the House is a deputy, a long-standing deputy, who I think could do very well running for senator if she wanted to. But she may well be thinking, why would I bother? I've got a relatively safe constituency where I think people know me, I know them. But of course, you know, that could go for anyone, but it can also go for newcomers. What would you do if you're a newcomer in the senatorial race and you know that you have to go up against a big name and you only get that one bite of the cherry? You're that new candidate who wants to get that head of operations job, but you haven't been in the loop for a few years. You've been watching what's going on. You know that it's not being quite run, the company's not quite being run as properly as it should be, but you need to go for that job, but you're not sure if they will have you. So you might want to try and go for that job and then actually, yeah, okay, I'll settle for the head of marketing. That's a pretty good job. So ultimately, it's down to the recruiters, isn't it, to decide who the best person is for the job. In our case, the recruitment team are the electorate, whether it's the electorate in an island-wide sense, whether it's electorate in those constituencies of deputy or for constable. So let's just talk about the nuts and bolts, I suppose. So in terms of the timeline, what we're really looking at here, and not everything changes, by the way, so ultimately, we're still aiming for an election date of Monday the 8th of June, is when the results will be known. So the election day, I think is correct, is Sunday the 7th of June. So all of the candidates who have been successful will be known by Monday the 8th of June. It just means we have 2 election periods. So the way it will work is that our last sitting as an assembly will be the sitting of March the 24th, 26th. That could go on if there's an extension up to the 2nd of April with continuation days. And then the senator nomination period would be from the 7th to the 11th of April. So it's a week period. The first 3 days, if there are enough candidates, it will be closed. But if there are not enough candidates come forward by the Wednesday, Thursday and Friday will also be an option. And then the senatorial campaign starts after that. The candidates are all going to be announced on the 14th of April under this system, and you'll have the senatorial election day on the 3rd of May. So it's less than a month, but it's about almost a 4-week period. Then we have a little break, so the senators can take a break, and they can maybe look around. They can take an interest in what's going on in the deputies' elections and the constables' elections. I would say that if you've just been elected as senator and you've got a fairly good idea that you want to be the chief minister, and there may be 2 or 3 notable members who have emerged from the senatorial elections who will be looking around thinking, okay, I need to put a team together, and I can't just do it from the 9 senators that have been elected. In fact, I might only be able to work with 3 or 4 of them. That person will want to take a keen interest in the other 40 seats that are being elected. And the candidates, of course, who are going into that will be able to answer the question with much more precision, I think. Who are you going to vote for Chief Minister if you are elected? And they'll have to be, you know, if they're reasonably politically literate, they'll have to say one of those 9. Because unless they're going to say, well, actually, I'm going to vote for this person who's not yet been elected, but he's running in St. Martin's and Grooville or wherever, they're going to say, what? No, we expect you to give an answer of one of those 9. So I think there are key advantages that having the 2 election periods will provide, which is essentially that it will give the public more information about what they're voting for at each time. So I think those are the 2 key arguments that I want to make. I don't really have a lot else to bring in terms of the advantages. So to reiterate, I think the advantages are that it will provide an appropriate scrutiny and focus both for the candidates and for the public and the media to focus on what's going on at each different election, which have a slightly different purpose. And the last point is that it will give more choice both to candidates and to the electorate in an informed way to make a decision about who they are voting for. And it may actually encourage competition, I suspect. I think if you have 2 election days, you will get more people, both from within and without, throwing their hats into the ring to have proper contested elections with great, hopefully, policy ideas being discussed that wouldn't otherwise be put into the mixer. So I do maintain the proposition, sir, and I look forward to what I hope will be an interesting and fruitful debate.
Thank you, Deputy. Is the amendment seconded? Yes, sir. Thank you. Chair of PPC.
Thank you, sir. The PPC doubts that going back to separate election days will boost voter numbers. In fact, we think it will have the opposite impact. The reasoning behind the single election day proposition adopted in 2009 was that it would boost turnout, particularly for the deputies' elections, and reduce election fatigue, because there had been a steady decline in turnout for the second election for deputies compared to the senatorial ones held a month earlier. In 2008, there had been a 10% reduction in the numbers of voters turning up at the polling stations between the senators' and deputies' elections. Amongst the arguments put forward for change was the need to create a level playing field so that all candidates had one shot at being elected and no one was given 2 bites of the cherry. The ability for people to get elected as a deputy when they had been unsuccessful as a senator was not regarded as being very popular with the electorate and was suggested as one of the reasons for the lower turnout. Deputy Tadier relies on the 2022 judicial graph costs, which are of course now out of date, but there is no doubt that holding 2 elections will be much more expensive and resource hungry. There are also cost efficiencies which will be lost by having to run 2 separate elections. Although Deputy Tadier refers to the islanders who volunteer their time to assist with the elections, the judicial graph is obliged to employ temporary staff to cope with the impact of postal vote and pre-poll. The task required individuals to be available for 7 weeks on an almost full-time basis. If Deputy Tadier's proposal is adopted, the judicial graph will need to seek further funding to cover the additional period of time that the temporary staff will be required. There would also be an increased burden on the parishes, who will have to run 2 elections over a 2-month period, requiring the goodwill of volunteers as well as officers working over 2 Sunday elections. The state's graph will be required to produce and circulate separate manifesto booklets and run 2 public engagement campaigns, and it is very likely that additional funding will be required. It should not be overlooked that the burden on the returning officers would increase if this proposal is adopted. The main returning officers are, of course, the jurats, and they have not been consulted in relation to this proposal. It is not known whether the jurats would be able to carry out the role of returning officer in relation to 2 Sunday elections taking place within a month of each other, whilst also meeting their court duties. Undoubtedly, one of the arguments for reintroducing a 2-stage election process is to allow candidates who are unsuccessful to stand as a deputy or constable a month later. While this ensures candidates who may have come close to gaining an island-wide mandate can have a second chance at election, it creates an unfair advantage for those ex-senatorial candidates who will have benefited from island-wide publicity via the hustings, manifesto booklets, posters and leaflets. A single-day election is fairer and more democratic as it provides a level playing field for all candidates. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Anyone else want to speak on this amendment? Deputy Rob Ward.
Thank you, sir. I think there's a number of key points here that were made both by the proposer and some points made by PPC. I don't know who agreed, what the sort of level of agreement was. I've spent my time over a career trying to recruit members of staff, and sometimes in difficult circumstances, because there aren't lots of, there's not a lot of physics teachers around, if I'm honest. I've worked in jurisdictions both in the UK and here where when you recruit, if you get a good field, you are absolutely over the moon. And you don't want just someone, we've got somebody, that's great. Are they any good? Well, they're okay. They're honestly okay. And you think, we'll make do. But when you have a field of 4 or 5, the best outcome for any interview process is I would employ every single one of those people. We have got an abundance now of choice. And we have done that. When we had a time in Jersey when that would happen. And you would go to another school and you'd say, are you recruiting? You'd say, yeah, we've got some really good people just come across. And because we brought people across and paid their expenses and showed them the island, we'd made an investment in those people, so we wanted to keep them. So we'd say, look, you know, you weren't successful this time, you're a brilliant candidate. They just had other, you know, there was something even better and they fitted. But there's another opportunity here if you want it. We don't want to use your talent, we want to use you elsewhere. And you would use that recruitment process to get the best people. Now, let's think about that. So we paid for a lot of people to come over. It was expensive. We spent the money, we invested. But what we did was we got the best people. And in the long term, that investment was worth every single penny. Now let's extrapolate that upwards. Let's move away from a single classroom into the running of this island, into the governance, into the law making, into the decision making that we make on this island. And if we cannot have a situation whereby we take the very best candidates, and if they are not successful for a small number of posts, they get an opportunity to go for those further number of posts and prove themselves to the electorate. Now, you can't pull the wool over the eyes of the electorate. Be very careful if you're thinking of standing and trying to do that. You maybe have a good campaign, but you've got to go into a district then, and you've got to knock on individual doors, and you've got to talk about those specific things that they want to hear, and you've got to know them. You can't just shoehorn people into a district. It doesn't work. And so those elections are different. And there are some other features that I think are important there. It may well be that people think, yeah, I really want to have a go at this. I'm going to go for senator. I'm going to have a go at this. Halfway through the campaign, they think, this is the last thing I want to do. Because this is not what I thought it would be. I don't like being in the fishbowl. I don't like doing these things. They won't stand for deputy. But they may have stood for deputy, become elected on a smaller field, and then not be the person that we thought they wanted to be. So there's a check and balance in place there through that election process. And I think it's slightly disappointing that we're talking about how we want to attract the best people for the job. We want to see people who can really represent and go through the work that we have to put up with in terms of the level of understanding of every piece of law that we pass, the legislation, the understanding of that, the working with people, the people skills, the communication skills, all of those transferable skills that you need to bring to do this, to perform this role in a way that's meaningful, plus the personal resilience, take all the other stuff that comes with it. That is not easy. Now, because it looks like there will be senators, a separate band, who I don't know what their role is, but there you go, we've been through that. That's a real high stakes thing to go for. And I think what we'll end up with is people playing safe and thinking, you know, I'll be safer here. None of us can assume we're going to get elected. That's very dangerous. I would never do that. In fact, I assume the opposite, but there we go. Perhaps I should be more positive. But we make a commitment to where we are. And so you won't get people standing for those posts. And you'll end up, I believe, if you're not careful, with a weaker field. And I think we need to do everything we can in this assembly to strengthen the field that's there, to ensure that people go. And if they don't get that, if there are a few votes off, in some elections people are just a few votes off, and they cannot take part in this assembly because they made that choice. Whereas they can say, actually, no, then I can now go for my district and I can make a really convincing and strong argument there and be a good candidate, I understand it, and they can convince the electorate. And our elections are different now. The world is different now. We have to be different now. We can't assume we're just not going to, people aren't going to participate in the past. We've talked so much about how we get people to participate. We have the voting age of 16 here now. Young people becoming more engaged. We're doing more and more for Democracy Week soon all the time. And all of the time we're going into schools and talking to young people across this assembly. This nonsense that we don't do that. Yes, we do. All of us, I think, have been into schools and spoken to young people. We're trying. And what this says to the electorate is, this is so important to you that you make these choices, that you're going to have one specific day for the senators, which is an island-wide vote. And when, in those elections, people who are standing for senator are going to tell you why they're standing, what their island-wide mandate looks like for them, what they think that job is about, and they are going to convince you with the policies that come forward and their future for this island. And then we're going to have a separate day for the deputies, which is a separate post, and they're going to do the same thing, and constables on that day as well, and they're going to do the same thing, and they're going to convince you, because this is important that you take part. And something that we don't do, which we should do in this assembly, is we should say to the electorate, you have a responsibility to engage in this democracy. Because you'll stand on social media and make comments about, it's terrible what's happening in these countries. They're not democratic. And then you don't participate. Well, you have a responsibility too. That's probably something I shouldn't say publicly, but I'll say it. People have a responsibility to engage. So let's give that opportunity, every opportunity that we can. A senatorial election on one day to say, there you go, choose your 9 senators. They will tell you what they're there for. They'll give you their aspirations. Some of those senators will say, I want to be Chief Minister, and this is my vision of being Chief Minister. And if they top the poll and become, it's very difficult to argue with that. I get that. I absolutely get that. And as it was mentioned, when deputies come across, they would say, my first question would be, do you support the person who topped the poll as Chief Minister? Now, that's a really difficult question for all of us, isn't it? It's a difficult question for me if it's not a member of my party. But you know what? I should be able to answer it. And that's what brings our democracy alive. That's what brings our democracy alive. But don't worry, I'm not too worried about that. But anyway, okay, I've got to be hopeful. I've got to be positive. That's what we've got to be. We've got to be positive about our elections. And I think that's where we should be going with this. And the reason this is a good thing to do, and yes, and you know what? Lots of us can bring an amendment to the government plan to say there's a bit of extra money to make this election happen this year. Okay? It's money well spent. It's about our democracy. Fine. Somebody can do that. If somebody does that, I'll support it or I'll do it myself. Because it's not a massive amount of money. And as for the inconvenience in terms of people, yes, but what we do is appreciate their work. Many of us have been around and seen elections and the commitment people made for those elections. And they do that because they recognise that their civic duty and the positive impact they have for their society. And it's wonderful when people engage themselves in that. And that's the way in which our communities that we build so well maintain as strong communities. So I would urge people, if you've not thought about supporting this, please think carefully about supporting it. Not simply about the strength of candidate, but the importance of election and the emphasis we can make on it and that duty to vote, and we can be serious about it from this assembly, and we can leave with a really clear message today to say, came to a conclusion that a lot of people didn't like, but we've come to another decision here that's saying that we're opening this up to absolutely everybody in the best way that we possibly can. So I urge members to think really carefully about this before you dismiss it, and let's try and encourage people to get involved in our elections as much as they possibly can. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Conor Tarbleson Brillard.
Thank you, sir. I feel that the proposers, the amendment is really a little bit of an ideological solution to elections. And whilst I appreciate the thoughts, I think we have to read the room. And in reading the room, sir, we've seen, going back several years, and I don't know how many of these debates I've sat through, but it's quite a number, sir. And the last major one, where we moved to a single election day, was quite fundamental. And that was supported. And I seem to recall that debate went on for some considerable time. One of the driving forces behind that proposition, sir, was that the public were annoyed at the fact that a failed senatorial member could pop up a couple of weeks later or a month later as a deputy. And that certainly was an issue that I recall being quite a fundamental point at the time. And I can't see that the public will change their views on that. Indeed, sir, in supporting the chair of PPC in his suggestion that costs will increase, certainly they will increase in the parishes. And for my parish with two polling stations, we probably have 12 ajoirs at each, namely 6 in the morning, 6 in the afternoon, and shopping over, and they come back in the evenings. It is quite onerous on volunteers. Yes, I think we'll get them on a Sunday. I rather hope we will. It's far more onerous, sir, in St Helier and those parishes with more polling stations to pull people out for those duties. And of course, notwithstanding that, the cost is going to be significantly more, I suppose double. So for those reasons, sir, I feel that I can't support the propositions as presented. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Tom. Deputy Scott.
Thank you, sir. I had an email and somebody suggested that I had supported this idea before, and I frankly can't remember whether I did or didn't, but if I did, my position has slightly changed, because as I've read through this amendment and thought about the logic and its express purpose, which it says is to ensure voters have the widest possible democratic choice at the election next year. And Deputy Ward was talking about situations where perhaps you had really good candidates who stood for senator and then didn't get through, and what a waste, and that sort of thing. And then I've been thinking, well, and bear in mind why people might stand for senator. I mean, some people say it's ego. I have always thought it's people who want to represent people island-wide. And then I go through the other type of representative for districts historically, and that's the parishes, that's the constables. And what I don't quite understand is why does this then refer to deputies? Because the actual shortage, the thing that people have been complaining about, in terms of there being a lack of democratic election, has been the constables. And if you've got people who actually are of quality, who stand to be senator, I would have thought they'd be quite capable of challenging constables. And I admired the fact that, I think it was a few years ago in my own parish, Reform fielded a candidate for constable. She hadn't been through the honorary system or anything like that, but it looked like we were going to have a choice. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, but that's where the shortage is. So if you're going to spend £121,000 to do this, that is where it should go, I think. And particularly when we are generally discussing, and I think that there is a sense of potential direction here as we discuss the overall purpose of the proposition, that it is fairer to the more senators you have, the more representation you have in the population. But we've got this historical position where we like parishes to be represented. Then you have to justify deputies more, their number, why you have them. Why don't you just simply have one for each super constituency? That's what wasn't really ever discussed in the referendum, about how deputies would be distributed. So I've decided, I think it was good thought. I think that when you develop the logic, it should have been a different proposition. I'm not convinced totally about whether one should be spending 121,000 now, but if I had taken this through in terms of my support, I probably would have amended it to do that, to change it for constables. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on this amendment?
So is it too late to ask a point of clarification? Because I do have to sum up, sir. And
That's all right, yes.
Could I just ask what was meant by the previous speaker saying she would have amended it to go for constables instead, just so I'm clear?
Yes.
It's actually saying that you could stand for deputies or constables, and that they would be, deputies and constables would be elected on the same day, yeah? I think so. So the idea is that you could, okay, so understand that a senator could go for constable or deputy, but if you're going to maximise democratic choice, you'd have 3 different elections. Yeah, okay, I accept that point about you could stand for constable, but then I'd rather direct it in that direction, have senators and deputies together, and then do constables, and it'd be cheaper. Sorry, I wasn't clear, and the deputy was quite right to ask me about that point. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, sir. I'm sorry, but I cannot support this proposition. It could give the impression that candidates are shopping around for any seat that they can get rather than respecting the mandate. And it really does create a 2-tier perception of members, as a defeated senatorial candidate who then becomes a deputy could be perceived as a second-choice politician, which really does risk undermining the status of deputies and, as the case may be, some constables if they had decided to stand as a senator and then went for the position of constable. Standing on an island-wide mandate as senator, but failing at the ballot box, gives an unfair advantage if they then take a second bite at the cherry and then stand locally. They'll already have had weeks of free exposure when the constituency
votes take place. There is a chance of confusion for voters who may feel puzzled. Didn't we just vote against that person? Why are they back up the ballot again? This undermines clarity in the democratic process and further reduces confidence in elections. When the two elections were phased out in 2011, one of the arguments was to avoid this cycle of rejection, re-entry, and to simplify the system to enable voters to make clearer choices in a single election. The old system of 2 election dates was criticised because it blurred the line between rejections and representations and gave defeated candidates an advantage in smaller elections and, as mentioned, undermined voter confidence. That's why it was reformed. There is no evidence to show that turnout would be improved, and the reason that turnout has not increased is complex and certainly cannot be set against not having a split election. We are now in September, sir, and only 9 months away from the election date that we had set on Sunday, June the 7th. The Deputy has given the date in his proposition for the first election as the 3rd of May, which is a bank holiday weekend. I do not believe that any discussions were held with the parishes or the judiciary as to the date of the proposed election, as for the proposed election date for senators. And I'm surprised and concerned that the Deputy has suggested that the date is on a bank holiday weekend and so close to that bank holiday weekend. I would suggest, therefore, that the staffing and financial costs will be far greater than he has suggested, which he's taken into account in his proposition. This amendment bearing in mind this is a bank holiday weekend, staffing costs for the parishes and judiciary, as I've said, will be vastly outweigh what he's suggested in his proposition. And this is a genuine question. Some of these staff have already booked because it's a bank holiday and it runs into the Liberation Day. Some of them have already booked holidays in the parishes. So, where do we go from there? So for all these reasons, I cannot support this proposition. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conor. Deputy Renouf.
Sorry. So thank you. There is, I think, one big flaw in the system as proposed in the current law, which involves a single election day for 3 classes of states members. It devalues the elections of deputies and constables. All the attention will be on the senator's election. That's kind of the whole point. It is intended that the chief minister and most ministers will be drawn from the senatorial ranks. Therefore, it will be dealing with island-wide issues. And therefore, the media and social media will focus their attention overwhelmingly on the senatorial beauty parade. So where will that leave the elections for deputies and constables on that single day? Hidden in the shadows. If there is one election day, I guarantee, apart from some dutiful public service reporting by the local news media and a few hustings, there will be no attention paid to what is going on in the electoral districts. The great strength of the present system is that it forces all members to engage in debates about all the issues that face the island. When I sat on the Electoral Commission, that was one of the key motivations behind the proposals that we brought forward. Outside of the ex officio role of the constables, there would be one class of states member, which would mean that all members had to be questioned about island-wide issues at hustings, and you couldn't have hyper-local candidates elected. And the reason why that was not a good thing is it would weaken the Assembly's ability to deal with the challenges the island faces. Now, I think we risk undermining that progress with a single election day that will devalue the deputy and constable's election. It will be unavoidably invisible. And there's a real cost to that. It perpetuates the myth that senators deal with island-wide issues and deputies and constables deal with local stuff. And in fact, that's the only way you can make sense of an election with 3 categories that is held on the same day. Why are there these different types of member? Someone might ask you. as they go to the polls? Well, the senators are elected on an island-wide mandate and deal with island-wide issues. Deputies or constables are elected in smaller districts and deal with local stuff. It makes sense. There's really no other way to explain it. You can't say that senators are being elected to form the government because that's patently not true. There will be deputies and probably constables in the next government. You can't even say that the senator's election is to decide who is chief minister, because the winner of the senatorial election is not at all guaranteed to become chief minister. And it also wouldn't explain why you're voting for lots of senators when there are only going to be one chief minister. So the only logical explanation on a single election day to explain the different categories is island-wide versus local. The problem is deputies deal with, and constables deal with island-wide issues just as much as senators. If senators return, island-wide issues will still be decided by the Assembly, where deputies and constables can't avoid those issues, even if they may not have been asked about them at the hustings. Once we're in the Assembly, we are all equal in terms of our voting power. So it is just as important for voters in the parishes and the deputy districts to endure proper scrutiny. A separate election day will return the focus to the deputies and elections. It will mean that the electorate consider their local representatives in a broader light. It will give space for to the debates about island-wide issues because it is a separate election. The case can be made. It will give back some oxygen to the other two elections, oxygen that will otherwise be entirely consumed by the senatorial vote in the single election day. Deputy Tadyer raised an interesting point, I thought, focusing on the changes, some of the dynamics that will change if we had separate election days. The idea that senators would be elected first, and that may create a little window for preparation of a new government, a process which is pretty rushed under the present system, is quite interesting. There's another point to be made, which it's probably worth just reflecting on, that the single election day was widely held at the time, over the years after it was adopted, as being the thing that led to the end of the senators, because people couldn't see the difference. They couldn't see the point. If you were electing everybody on the same day, why on earth did you have different categories of people? So it might be a case of being careful what you wish for there. But to answer the point about the level playing field being made by the chair of PPC, it isn't a level playing field with a single election day. The level of scrutiny will be entirely different. There's actually a very contradictory couple of arguments that are being presented. There's an argument that says some people gain advantage from the exposure in the senator election and how this would be unfair come the deputies election. But then the argument is also made that people don't like candidates standing in a second election, and they'll be punished for it. So it's both an advantage and a disadvantage, it seems. So that seems to kind of slightly cancel each other out. I think the key point here is the electorate get to make the choice. They choose whether it was a chicken run to go back to the deputies election or whether it's a sensible response to the fact that they only had lost by 3 votes in a senatorial election. And that perhaps having somebody with 10,000 votes in a senator election not quite elected is quite a strong mandate to stand in a deputies election. And if they were elected in that, they'd have those extra votes there as a sort of extra little bit of credibility. So it can't be both. And I think, as I say, the correct answer is that this should be decided by the electorate. So what are the objections? Single election days have better turnout, apparently. Well, the previous deputy elections, when they were held on separate election days, were sabotaged by the fact that so many were uncontested. It's not surprising there was a low turnout in the deputy elections in the old days, because they were so uncontested. In 2008, there were 4 uncontested deputy seats. In 2005, there were 6 uncontested deputy seats. Going back in time to 1999, there were 9 uncontested deputy seats. It is not surprising that turnout on a separate election day was lower for a deputy's election when so few people actually had to cast a vote. The whole thing felt much more desultory, I think. But the difference is that now we have multi-member districts. And multi-member districts at the last election, we will recall, had no uncontested elections. And indeed, I think one of the things that encouraged me to stand was the fact that they were multi-member districts, because it is a very different business standing in a multi-member seat when you get to put yourself forward as one person being selected out of 3 or 4 or 5 than it is to challenge for one seat, when you have to say to people, it's me or them. And if then somebody says, well, I prefer that person, that's it. Whereas under a multi-member seat, you can say, yeah, I get that, but you've got other votes. And that, I think, encourages people to stand. It makes those elections more competitive, and that's a huge advantage of multi-member seats. So I think the argument about turnout is a red herring. I don't think it stands up. I think there were other reasons for the low turnout of the separate election day. So bringing back a split election will increase costs, which they undoubtedly will. Of course, bringing back senators will also increase costs. It's administratively more complex, but apparently that's not quite enough to become too much extra money. That's all fine. It's only when you get to the separate election day that we cross some invisible line that says we're spending too much money on this electoral process, and we should retrench back. And it strikes me that one thing we can be sure of is that if we had passed split election days back in March, we would absolutely have found the money and the ways to make it work. And nobody who supports senators would be standing here saying, you know what, I'm going to have to row back from my support for senators because it's just going to cost too much. If this amendment is passed, the money will be found, because it will then be the only way in which senators can come back. So my final reason for voting for this, and since we seem to be majoring on feelings and instincts and emotions in this debate, is I think it'll be more interesting with two elections. I think it'll be a bit more fun. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Catherine Curtis.
Thank you, sir. I'm pleased to follow the previous speaker. I'm concerned that a single election day will limit the field of candidates for senator. And if, as some members believe, that senators have an important role to play, then we should be maximising the opportunities for people to stand and not limiting them. If we are going to have senators, we should not be putting blocks in the way of people standing, but that's what we will be doing by holding senator and deputy elections on the same day. We shouldn't make it harder for people to stand for elections. It is up to the electorate to make their choices, not up to us as the State's Assembly to try to shape or limit in any way those who might stand. And I think that if the senator and deputies elections are held on the same day, that there will be current deputies who will not put themselves forward. Perhaps those of us who've only served one term and who do not want to continue, and who do want to continue in their role, but do not have the confidence to be sure that they be elected as a senator. And yet some of these deputies could be the choice of the electorate to hold a senatorial role. So by holding these elections on the same day, we are limiting the choices available to voters, and that is anti-democratic. If the elections are to be held on the same day, I expect that any sitting States member who puts themselves forward for the senator elections will be members who have a great deal of confidence in their abilities and their popularity, whether those thoughts are justified or not. Alongside these self-assured members, there will be newcomers standing who think they have nothing or little to lose, and newcomers
are unlikely to have the skills and knowledge to go straight into a ministerial role, as I think the successful senators would be expecting to do. There may be exceptions, but it's perhaps too much to expect of a newcomer to the role. So we could end up with a senator election with a small number of sitting states members and a large number of newcomers. My own memories of senator elections are of the days when they were held on separate days. That's how it's worked for, I think, 63 out of 74 years. I think it was only for 2 terms that this changed to a single election day. And I don't think there's any evidence to show that that improved things. The normal practice of separate election days allowed for a clear distinction between senators and deputies for the voting public, and it allowed for some unsuccessful senator candidates to stand again as deputies, and there is nothing wrong with that. We have to trust the public to be able to make good decisions. I think the only valid concern about holding the elections on separate days is the extra burden placed on the parishes. And if necessary, I would be happy to bring an amendment to the budget that funding be made available to the parishes for any extra costs involved. Deputy Miller, Deputy Luce and others spoke of the strong reactions they'd come across from members of the public who support the role of senator. We are representatives of the public, we are not delegates. Of course, we're not delegates, but I do expect those deputies who value the wishes of their public so highly to also understand that separate days for the elections will give those members of the public more choices and clearer choices. So to sum up, a single day for senator and deputy elections will prioritise those members who have great belief in themselves and those candidates with nothing to lose, and prevent greater choice for voters.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else want to speak on this amendment? Deputy Mezek.
Thank you, sir. It's been an interesting debate so far, and interesting to hear the different perspectives, and it'll be, I think, amusing when it comes to the vote on this, where in the previous debate, members who found themselves ferociously on opposite sides, some will then find themselves on the same side in this one, which I think gets to a point that I make frequently in debates about electoral reform, which is that every one of us has a completely different and unique vision for what the perfect voting system for Jersey looks like, and every one of us has to accept that we're not going to get our way. We are going to have to compromise with one another to various degrees to get a system that is functional, democratically accessible, and a good way of electing members to this assembly. And though I am obviously very concerned about the reintroduction of senators, this amendment would make me significantly more relaxed about it, because it would allay some of the major concerns that I have about reintroducing another class of states member to be elected on the same day through the same processes as all the other members of the Assembly. And so I would suggest, sir, that this is, as a moderating amendment, can help bring people together and hopefully get closer to a bit more unity and consensus on this, where otherwise it is extremely difficult to maintain that, because we all have different perspectives on how a system should be built up. But I think this has some major advantages to it, sir. The first one, sir, is that this is actually a more authentic representation of what the senatorial position had in our democracy for so many years. The position of senator existed for 74 years, and for 63 of those, they were elected on different days. Isn't it funny, sir, how when the days were combined, it only took 2 years before the public came out in a referendum to vote to scrap them, and then a few years after that for the Assembly to catch up with that and scrap them. That came very quickly after the rolls were put together to be elected on the same day. And I think that that is for the reasons that Deputy Reniff spoke about, is because it made members of the public question, what on earth is the point in having these two different roles, when functionally in this Assembly, there is no difference whatsoever between senator and deputy. The only difference is their constituency size. They have the same rights, same duties, same ability to serve in any role in the Assembly. Of course, the constables are slightly different to that because they have their role in the parishes that they're elected to as well. So there is a logic in the difference there, at least. But since the only difference between senators and deputies is the perception of seniority, and that is all it is, it's not written into our rules in any shape or form, it's the perception of seniority, and there's an expectation from the public that the most senior roles in government will go to those elected from the senatorial benches. The best way to facilitate a fair and even contest and opportunity for the public to say, this is what our majority view is of who should occupy the senatorial benches, is to have that free and open contest held in isolation. And to do that before the deputies and constables elections provides the public that opportunity to do that, to focus on it, and then a few weeks later elect the rest of the Assembly. And my biggest reservation about reintroducing senators to be elected on the same day is that other members have spoken of, which is that we're going to have a big focus on the election of 9 out of 49 members and very, very little focus on the election of 40 out of 49 members. So around 80% of the membership of this Assembly will be elected in a system where there is not as much focus and engagement as there ought to be, because people will be too excited and distracted by the senatorial contest, which is where it's likely to be that the next Chief Minister would come from. So that's understandable. Splitting them means you get a much greater chance of having more heavily and more competitive elections for the deputies' districts. Deputy Renouf mentioned before about seats being uncontested previously. If you're having to, as a candidate, pick and choose between which role you go for, that essentially offers you the same job at the end of it. That spreads out candidates across more constituencies technically, which means you're going to find them under contested as a result of that. So splitting them enables candidates to come forward to pitch themselves for senator. That will include new candidates as well. That's the other thing we have to think about is that the last election, if you were a new candidate or someone thinking of approaching it, you pretty much stood where you lived, or if you had a more close association with a particular part of the island, it was easy. I'm standing. Oh well, I go where I live then. That's pretty easy to do that. Now we're going to say to candidates who will have absolutely no idea of what public perception of them may actually be, because they've never run for election before. You've got to choose between whether you pitch yourself for island-wide or district when they've never had to do so before. And that, I think, will be a calculation to introduce in the minds of prospective new candidates that won't be helpful in any sense. So this argument about 2 bites at the cherry is amusing, because I remember the last time I voted in a deputies election that was held a month later than the senators, and that was in 2008. And in my deputy district, there was a candidate who ran for deputy who had a month previously ran for senator. And my observation of him as a senatorial candidate was that I didn't want him as my local deputy in a million years. And he didn't win. And I can see why, because his senatorial campaign demonstrated to the public that they didn't want him in any shape or form. But of course, there are some who may go for senator, and members of the public may think, not a bad candidate, fair enough, but wouldn't quite want you on the benches occupying the more senior roles, would prefer you to do a bit of time doing your local representation as a deputy in the meantime. And that was something, sir, that when we had the parish road shows in support of P2, I did hear that from some members of the public. There are members of the public who, for various reasons, lament the reforms to our voting system that happened from 2008 onwards, the reduction in numbers of senators, the aligning of terms, aligning of election days. People have all sorts of different views of that, and there are still people who would prefer to go back to the 12 senators with 6-year term system that we had once upon a time. This more accurately reflects the heritage of that role and the logic of it, the logic that gave that role some longevity that it lost when they were combined into a single day. Sir, this question about cost, I really think that's being over-egged here, because in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge cost by any stretch at all. And there is going to be a greater cost next year, a greater funding next year to non-ministerials in our budget, as you know, we produce this every year and have to allocate money to non-ministerials. There's going to be more next year to cover the election anyway. And so we should adjust that number accordingly if we're going to hold the election in a different format. And that's absolutely right that we should do that. And I totally agree with Deputy Catherine Curtis. I'd 100% support extra funding for the parishes in order to make that happen, because, sorry to break it to you, but democracy comes at a cost, and it's a cost worth paying, especially to have a better election system and ultimately a more representative parliament at the end of it. But so if we stick with a system of electing different categories of member on the same day, we'll have under-contested elections, 40 out of 49 of our members not subject to the same kind of scrutiny that they ought to, and which we all were at the last election, which was the greatest virtue of that last election. And then we get the results of those under-contested and under-scrutinised elections, then we've got to live with that for 4 years, even if it's not actually reflective of what the public wants. Splitting them out fixes that. It's how the roles used to be elected for the vast majority of the time of the existence of the senatorial role, and it provides a safeguard that I would feel much more comfortable with, that I don't feel comfortable at all with if the roles are being elected on the same day, as I opposed that previously. I would be much more relaxed about that. And so I say to members, having all of us holding very, very different views on this subject, this is a way of bringing us together and hopefully getting a bit more consensus on this, instead of it being so divisive as it constantly proves to be.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Balash.
It's just really, sir, a question for the Deputy. The 3rd of May is a Sunday, and I wonder if the Deputy has consulted with the members of the Royal Court who are going to have to preside over the election on this day, and indeed the honorary officials in the parishes, as to whether they are content to work another Sunday in order to make sure that the system works.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Miller.
Thank you, sir. I wasn't really intending to speak on this, but I find myself unable to ignore it. So when I arrived in Jersey, I found the different categories of states member not at all difficult to get to grips with. Constable, a deputy, senators. It's not difficult. I found that really simple to understand. What I always found really peculiar was 2 different election days, where someone could stand for appointment in one capacity, lose, and then stand again a few weeks later. It was, as I'm sure other people have said, having another bite at the cherry. And it just always seemed very odd and just odd and peculiar beyond words. We seem to be supporting this for a number of reasons. Firstly, that it means if we have the dual election, we won't risk losing good people. Losing good people in whose mind? Everybody will have a different view as to who is a good person to be elected or not. Every election, good people are not elected or lose their seats. I can think of the former Chief Minister. Some people would say he was a good person, he lost his seat in the last election. Some people would say possibly that was an absolutely right thing that the electorate turned against him. I'm not going to comment on that, but every election, good people lose seats. There were good people in the last election who were not elected, and some of those people got more votes than some people who were elected. That's just by the by. The voters decide who they want, and they decide from the pool in front of them. And I would also say that if anybody, everybody who stands in an election in any capacity has to make a basic risk assessment. Am I going to risk? What is the risk to me of standing? What is the risk if I don't get elected? I took a very big risk because I gave up a very good job to stand for election. And I did it on the basis that if I wasn't elected, I would find something else. But you make that decision, and people will make the decision as to whether they stand for senator or deputy or constable. And I agree, it would be good to see more contested constable elections. That would benefit our democracy. Most of us, I think, would agree with that. As Deputy Reniff said, with having more than one deputy in each district makes it easier to stand for deputy, because there were cases where people were reluctant to stand against a sitting deputy. But you make that decision, and if you decide, going back to Catherine Curtis, what your confidence level is, or what you think what your skills are, what you are best placed, if you decide to stand as a senator, you take the risk of not being elected. I remember very close to polling day last year, there were 8 candidates in our district. There were 8 candidates for 4 seats. And someone said to me that there were 3 candidates who were clearly going to be elected, and it was a race for 4th. And it was pretty clear that I was not at top of the race for 4th. So that's a very depressing position to be in. But it comes down to the voters. And if anybody, I would suggest that if anybody stands for election thinking that they are a shoo-in, or that they are guaranteed to be elected, there is something very far wrong with that democracy. Nobody should feel entitled to be elected. We all have to fight for our places regardless of what capacity we're standing in. We all have to go, whatever. I can't imagine that if people stand as senators, that they're not going to go around and knock on doors and hand out leaflets and do everything that everybody else does. You know, that would be quite absurd in the current environment. Everybody has to fight for their place regardless of the capacity, and everybody should be fighting for their place. And if the electorate decide not to elect good people, then that is the view, that is the choice of the electorate. Just 2 more points. One of the main criticisms of having a single election day is that deputies won't get any publicity in the papers or the media. I think that's a bit unkind to our media, who I am sure they will cover the election fully. They covered constable elections where there were them, where they existed last time, where they were contested. And if our media are not covering deputy elections, again, there is something wrong. I'm sure they will cover those, just as I'm sure they will cover the senatorial elections. And lastly, I would just like to reflect on Deputy Catherine Curtis's comments about newcomers, the risk of newcomers standing as senators and taking ministerial roles. We already have that risk. Even without senators, Deputy Moore's government, from recollection, had 6 newcomers in ministerial positions. I was one of them, Deputy Binney was one of them, Deputy Ward, Deputy Reniff, Deputy Wilson, we all had ministerial roles as newcomers. And I do find it slightly astonishing that if Deputy Mezek has stood twice to be Chief Minister, the proposition that his government would not have included the 5 newcomers, I think there's 5, in the Reform Party in his government because they were new, I think that's unlikely. With or without senators, we need to be open to newcomers taking ministerial roles or scrutiny roles, and there were a good number of newcomers into this assembly, and I think we have all done our job fully and carefully and with our full energies. And I don't think we should ever discount the value that newcomers can bring to this assembly or suggest that they do not deserve to be here or have ministerial or scrutiny or any other role that this assembly elects them to. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Conataba St John.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure, like others, I feel as though I've been in a time machine this afternoon, but here we are. So there's been some compelling arguments made for this on both sides. So whilst acknowledging the work of the GREF, the Judicial GREF and JURATS, and as mentioned by Deputy Baloch, the Honorary Police and Volunteers, one important group of people have not been considered so far, and that is the electoral administrators. So those men and women aren't volunteers. Those people are our electoral administrators for the election. That is a big job and a big responsibility. And the proposal is asking those people to give up a bank holiday weekend and to participate in a second election just a few weeks before a second round. I wouldn't underestimate, sir, the effort and time and commitment that these people put in, and we should pay tribute to those people, and we should consult with them, because it really is a challenge for them. So another problem with the bank holiday weekend, and I firmly believe we will get volunteers to assist us on a Sunday, and I'm confident I could get 2 teams of volunteers on 2 different Sundays. However, sir, I would be relying, and the other parishes would be relying, on the same electoral administrators and the same administration staff, sir. And I think it's wrong that they have not been consulted. So in terms of cost, yes, we can cover the cost in one shape or other, but if the count is going to be on a bank holiday, you also need to consider the time off you've got to give people as a statutory right to those employees. That just adds to it. So this morning I mentioned election expenses, and it would be possible for a senatorial candidate to focus a good percentage of their £13,000 expense on a particular district or parish. Unsuccessful in the senatorial election, they could then spend their next allowance in that same district or parish, sir. So that would put people at a distinct disadvantage if they hadn't put their names forward to spend that much money. That's not to mention the free coverage given to candidates by the media and by the GREF, sir. So I think a lot more thought needs to be given to this, and we shouldn't be adding to the proposed changes that we've already discussed today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conor. Does anyone else to speak on this amendment? I call upon Deputy Leo to reply.
So thank you for that, and thanks to members who have spoken in the debates. I suppose the key point I want to make here is that what I envisaged was that we're going to be relaunching a category of member that hasn't existed for 4 years, which some of the public may have forgotten about, others have been clambering to get back. And I think there are merits in having their own separate election period for that, to allow the focus to be on the election for senator. When members have talked about having 3 different elections, let's get the terminology right here. We already have 3 different elections. It's just that they take place concurrently. So there are 3 elections that take place concurrently. And whilst I accept that in an ideal world, or perhaps not even in an ideal world, that there are logical calls to have 3 different election periods, what I would say is if it's difficult enough to get 2 election periods to go through with 2 different election dates, it would be even more difficult to get 3 different election dates. The other point is that the reason I've put senators on one hand and constables and deputies on the other is that essentially senators and deputies are elected under the same law, and therefore it seems to be reasonable that there's a distinction made between the 2 categories there. Parish elections, I don't see having any problem of them taking place at the same time as the local elections, because in many cases they overlap. They're parish elections where, certainly in St Brelard, we'll be electing St Brelard deputies and St Brelard constables, and of course in the other districts it will be for 2 or 3 parishes which will be at the same time as their constable. So in essence what I'm saying, people will be going to the polling station to vote for their constable and to vote for their local deputies at the same time. I do think there needs to be a distinction, like I've said. I think the focus and the kind of arguments that were being made at the senatorial elections in 2026, I would imagine are going to focus on things like this. They're going to be, what's your vision for the island's economy in the next 30 years? Should Jersey have a university? What are you going to do for the tourism industry? Do you think that the finance industry is completely sustainable? Do you think that there are things that we need to be doing to make it more competitive? Do you think that transport links and our interconnectivity between the islands and between the UK and France are sufficient? What will you be doing to make sure that our freight links are improved? Now, I'm not saying that any of those arguments won't feature in the constables or deputies elections, but the real forum for those kind of ideas, as well as, of course, the ideas around tax and spending. Does Jersey need to raise more revenue? How is it going to do that? Have we got a falling population? And how are you going to make sure that we have a thriving economy that supports the population and a population that supports the economy into the future? All of those kind of ideas are going to be at the forefront of the senatorial hustings, however many they have. They may be in all the parishes, they may be taking place at the sports stadia that we have in Jersey, which no doubt will be filled to the brim. Who knows? Make Jersey great again would be the slogan of some of the senatorial election candidates. And that's all great. And I think that deserves an election period and an election day where those kind of issues can be spoken on at a very high level. And then once those debates have been had, I would imagine, actually, it's not about which day of the week an election is held on. It's about how engaging the election period is. And, you know, there's lots of criticism about elections that have taken place across the Atlantic, that they're divisive, etc. But one thing we can be sure of is that elections in other countries where people are willing to say what they mean and put their ideas on the table and actually act on those ideas and deliver them are really what engages the public. And I think with that single election for senators taking place first, followed by a brief pause where the deputies and the constables will then also come into the mix, I think there won't be election fatigue. I think what it will be is like there'll be a main event, if you like, and then there'll be a subsequent event where the rest of the assembly is chosen. Albeit, of course, it's the majority of the seats are going to be chosen. So it's not saying that one election isn't necessarily more important than the other. It's saying that the elections serve a different purpose. So let me address what I think has become perhaps not the elephant in the room, but I think it's a compelling argument that, yes, once in this 4-year period, we are going to be asking some parish staff to be working on a Sunday, and it will be over a bank holiday weekend. Now, if it was in my gift to suggest that there's anything that could be done to move that, I would have thought better of it, sir. But what I would say is I don't think it's a reason not to do this. I think we ultimately have to put our wider democracy on the line here and say that if this is a good idea to do, we should do it anyway. And I think there should be sufficient members in every parish who would come forward, as we know people do in the island, to volunteer for different events. I know, for example, sir, that there are different sporting events going on over the autumn. There have been some already. I'm an amateur runner, sir. I don't know if I qualify yet because I've probably stuck at it for 6 weeks and I've not done any great distances. But I know, and I do follow people who do half marathons, who do marathons, and that they'll be going out in the wind and the rain over the weekends to give up their time to make sure that the runners are safe and that they're watered during the course of that marathon, sir. Candidates will be doing their own marathon, whether it's running for senator or running in a different election, sir. And I do know that if we all put a call out for help within the parishes, that there'll be no shortage of people who come forward for service, even on a weekend. And I think there is a trade-off. Yeah, of course, we're doing Sunday elections because it's going to bring more people out. That's the idea. That's the hope, at least. It remains to be seen. But it also means that a different type of person who usually works in the week can put themselves to volunteer. And I would suggest that we actually put a call out for people to be trained up now to be electoral administrators to assist. And we also know that actually adjurants can be appointed under the States of Jersey law, sir. I think Article 17 says that it doesn't have to be a jurat, of course. Another public official can be appointed as authorisé for the poll in each electoral district. That, of course, is common sense. There are only 12 jurats, so should one or more of them not be available, there would need to be other people who could be put into their place. So an authorisé could be anyone else who is sworn in to do that role, sir. So I think this is a chance for actually the parishes to lead by example. I'm not saying it's a small ask, but I know that the parishes do treat their staff well, and there will be a long enough lead-in period to say that actually those of you who are available to work over the weekend, that is great, and we'll make sure that, you know, perhaps they can be given some time off in lieu and be given another day off at a time when they might also want to avail themselves of that. So I don't make, by any means, any small money of that, sir. We do appreciate the work that goes on in the parishes, but it's a joint effort for a very important election that will take place, ultimately not just to elect 9 members of this assembly, but 9 members from whom the next Chief Minister will no doubt come. So I just addressed that issue first, sir. I think I've addressed Deputy Scott's point, and it is correct that she did vote for this the last time round. I'm not necessarily going to say that I think she's understood it better this time. I would have thought she was hopefully can transport herself back to the first debate that we had and perhaps recollect why she voted for it the first time round. Because I think that is quite important that I think she got the ultimate argument that there is benefit to having 2 different election periods. I think Deputy Renouf actually hit the nail on the head when we seem to be given 2 different arguments. We're told on the one hand the public don't like candidates who have had 2 bites of the cherry, but at the same time that the candidates who have had 2 bites of the cherry will benefit from having name recognition and therefore the public will vote for them. So is that because the public are stupid and that they'll just vote for someone if you say their name long enough and loud enough and show them enough photos of that person? Or is it because they want to vote for the policies that that person espouses? And let's look at the argument. You know, I think this is a fundamental we can't get away from. I could use hypothetical figures or real ones, but let's take an election that might have taken place in 2018, and there are, you know, we're going to have 9 seats this time, but in 2018 there were 8 seats. So the person who came 9th in 2018 under our new system would be elected at that time. They would be senator. What did they have to do? The person who came 9th at that time had to wait another 4 years for the next job application process. Whereas, in fact, you know, somebody else who might not have stood for senator but got elected in one of the parish districts came 4th, had the privilege of never being tried and tested and getting elected on perhaps, you know, 1,000 or so votes. That's the reality of what can happen, and it doesn't mean that that person would not make a good deputy or a constable. What it says is that actually, you know, when a candidate, whoever that is, stands for election, I don't think that anybody goes into it to lose. I think what they do is that they go in with it with the right ideas, hopefully trying to win, but you know, the public can't vote for everyone if there are 20 candidates. So why would we exclude potentially very good candidates from being elected who could otherwise make good deputies or good constables? I'm just going to check my notes to make sure I haven't missed anybody out at this point. So I think I've made all the points I need to make, so I'm going to draw the debate to a close there. Simply to say that I completely acknowledge the work that the parishes will need to do in this. I just ask that the parishes would, as I said, put that call out for volunteers and that I think having the 2 election periods will really add value to the election process. And I notice the lights on for the Constable of St. John.
Sir, could I ask for a point of clarification?
Yes.
Sir, does the Deputy agree that the electoral administrator for a parish is the secretary of the parish unless another employee of the parish, and therefore some parishes are very limited by the amount of people they can choose from?
Yes.
So yes, I'm not saying that the electoral administrator isn't a member of the parish. What I'm saying is that the vast majority of people that are involved in an election on election day will be volunteers, and I'm saying that there are different pools of volunteers that can be called upon. Yes, I accept that.
Is the appel called for? The appel has been called for.
Thank you.
Members are invited to return to their seats. This amendment is not subject to Standing Order 89A, and therefore a simple majority will suffice for its adoption. I invite the greffier to open the voting. All members have the opportunity of casting their votes. ask the greffier to close the voting. Announce the amendment has been rejected. 18 votes for, 28 votes contra. Yes.
Those members voting for the Conitaba St Helier and Deputies Southern, Labby, Tadier, Morell, Rob Ward, Mezek, Miles, Renouf, Catherine Curtis, Feltham, Rose Binet, Jern, Tom Binet, Kovac, Coles, Owls and Porre, and those members voting contre, the Conitaba St Lawrence, St Bernard, Trinity, St Peter, St Martin, St John, St Clement, Grouville, St Juan, St Mary and St Saviour, and Deputies Luce, La Higuera, Ayer, Gardner, Gorst, Barnum, Balash, War, Scott, Miller, Howe, Ferry, Barbara Ward, Wilson, Stevenson, Andrews and Doublé.
Now come to the next amendment lodged by the Comité des Conitables. I'll ask the greffier to read the amendment.
Page 18, Article 11. In the inserted Article 6G5 for 6 months, substitute 9 months.
Conitable.
Thank you, sir. This is effectively a consequential amendment. We've spoken of the various changes. We've noted the various changes that have taken over previous years, sir. And this came to light that if we weren't to introduce this at this stage where we were proposing the senatorial changes, it would involve another proposition at a later time. So effectively what it does is pushes out the present 6-month period in which a senator or deputy may withdraw from the Assembly and a ultimate by-election from 6 months to 9 months, purely to enable the administration to get the work in and the various elections in, and so that it can all run smoothly. If that weren't to happen, so we particularly because we've got this proroguing situation now since 2021, we would end up in a situation where if someone were to be re-elected as a new member 6 months before general election, it would be, by the time they got elected, there'd be a very short period in which they would be sat in this assembly to serve any useful purpose. So it was felt that if that was stretched out to 9 months, it would be far more practical and enable the proper arrangements to be made. So, sir, I make the proposition.
Is the amendment seconded?
Yes, sir.
Chair of PPC.
Thank you, sir. The committee is broadly supportive of this proposal. An election places additional burdens on all those involved behind the scenes, including the parishes, judicial gref and state's gref staff, not to mention the cost to the public. We estimate that a by-election for a deputy, depending on whether it's for a single parish or a multi-parish constituency, would cost around £30,000. And the cost for a senator for an all-Ireland mandate would ramp up the costs associated with all-Ireland hustings, and the distribution of booklets could comfortably double that sum as a conservative estimate. As the committee have noted, the current elections legislation and the need for the Assembly to prorogue before the nomination period means that any new member joining the Assembly via a by-election held close to the 6-month limit would have a very short time to find their feet, although they would be able to obviously vote on matters for the debate for what could be less than 4 months. The PBC supports this amendment, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Does anyone else speak on this amendment? Rob Ward.
Thank you, sir. I suppose the question is, what's price democracy? Obviously, it's, a bit too expensive, a bit too inconvenient, and we can go 6 months without representation for somebody. I would ask a question, though, which is, what if it's more than one person? What if it's 2? What if it's 3? Is there a limit? Is there a number? because we never know what happens in the future, if there is a number of people left at the same time, or if there is a significant scandal, I don't know. Who knows? We might get really exciting politics. But I think it's really important that we send a message that says, you know, if you're here for 3 or 4 months, you're here for 3 or 4 months. You're representing your constituents and you've had an election. But it's inconvenient because there's a cost to everything. Everything has a cost, but nothing has a value anymore. That's a real mistake we're making in our society, in my view. So I can grandstand a bit and say we do that too often. Cost, everything's got a price, but nothing's got a value anymore, it seems. And you know, what price? What do we do about that lack of representation for a group of constituents? If it's a constable election, would that be without a constable for that time? That's okay. Well, perhaps constables don't like that. Senators, such an important role. The constables have all voted for senators. Most of the constables, have voted for senators to bring them back for an island-wide. But, you know, if a senator leaves or steps down, then it can be 6 months without a senator. That's okay. This is inconsistent. And I think we had a point before, and I suppose it really doesn't matter that much, but I think we do need to have these discussions about what the prices of democracy, what we mean by the length of term, and what you can achieve, even if it's for a short time, because it gives somebody a starting point. If you get elected in a by-election, you've been through that election, and you have the right, the democratic right to sit in this assembly, even if it's for 1 day. You've been a state's member. And as no, I won't say that. Something else, I'll say at a different time. But anyway, that's my thoughts on it. So sorry if I've amused myself. I shouldn't. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Morell.
Thank you, sir. And I had no intention of speaking on this kind of debate because it just seemed like common sense to me. The committee's decision, but you know, Deputy Ward, it's always good to hear people with other perspectives, and in this one, I just hadn't thought about it. I guess it's when Deputy Ward said, "What price democracy?" and I thought, well, I think that's kind of missing the point here. There is also the level of inconvenience to the actual electors. I know there can be people who don't like the idea that they elect somebody for so many months and then they're back again electing potentially somebody else. It doesn't give that person who does stand for election much time to show very much of themselves as a democratically elected representative at all when you have, you know, the 6-month gap. And like you're saying, it's not really 6 months, it's proroguing, but also, you know, government doesn't bring anything forward, they go into purdah, etc. It really is an incredibly short period of time. And so for me, it's not so much, I understand Deputy Ward's kind of principles, but this is one of those where I think principles kind of hit reality and practical reality. And I have often thought about this and thought that it should be a longer period of time between, you know, the last point where someone resigns or leaves the office in other ways and when an election should take place. So from that perspective, I just think it's a good practical compromise for, yes, the parish in organising those elections, but I think also the electors in actually engaging with the election and feeling like they've had at least some time to understand their new representative. That representative has had a chance to show the things they can do before a new election is brought in. So I'm speaking more out of surprise, sir, just because it was one of those where, yeah, Deputy Ward's thoughts provoked my own thoughts themselves. So thanks to Deputy Ward for doing so.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Mezek.
Thank you, sir. Just to say, sir, that I'm obviously opposing this as well. I was first elected to the Assembly in a by-election after a seat had become vacant not that long before a general election. My first part of my time in the Assembly was for about 8 months, and I had promised voters in my by-election campaign that I would hit the ground running and I'd be contributing from day one. That was right. I was lodging questions before I'd even had my government email address allocated to me, and in that short period I brought a proposition to the proposition that eventually paved the way for legalising same-sex marriage in Jersey. And I just make that point that it is absolutely possible for a capable and decent candidate who only has a short period of time before having to face re-election in a general election to make a difference in that time, and I don't think they should be deprived of that, and I don't think the electorate should be deprived of representation for such a long time either.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Moore. Sorry, Deputy Scott.
So just on the theme of what price democracy, I do believe that the electorate sometimes doesn't understand there is a price. I believe that the electorate doesn't realise the cost of organising elections, and sometimes, they don't even realise that many of us fund, when we organise our own election campaigns, we're actually funding them. I know some people think, notwithstanding all the stuff about declaring election expenses, think that all their costs are covered. I think that Deputy Ward has a point. It's really important to explain to the electorate, actually, you know, when you think, well, so what, I've got a vote and it's free. And in fact, this happened to me. Somebody came to me and said, I'm not voting in the elections because I wanted senators. And I said, hold on. Do you know how much it cost me to stand? Because I want you to think about that, because your vote is free. And then she carried on a bit and said, well, you know, in the last senators' election, I voted for Deputy Mazik. And I said, well, you know, I understand your reasons, because you did have reasons, but you've got to understand that he didn't want senators. And so whenever we vote, we've got to think about our priorities, which, of course, we have to do as a government. So but that's the general line. I don't think it's realistic. However much you say, well, you know, people should be representing this, they've got to understand the reality of being represented and what that entails, and what that entails for the people who actually stand, for the people who organise the elections. So I think we can actually explain that to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak on this amendment? I call upon the Conitard to reply. Conitard.
Thank you, sir, and I thank those members who've contributed. What price democracy? I don't think we're putting a cost on this whatsoever, and I agree entirely with what the Deputy's saying, so we wouldn't wish to put anything in the way whatsoever. With regard to limit on numbers of states members dropping, falling off the perch, or whatever you might call it, well, no, there isn't a limit, and we hope it doesn't occur. But the reality of this, sir, is that it's really a housekeeping matter, as I suggested. In response to Deputy Mazik, I think the rules have changed since he was first elected in terms of times. This is all about timescales. And if we go back to this present 6-month period, it's the current time frame which was originally introduced in 2011, when it replaced the time frame for a casual vacancy occurring after the 31st of March, immediately preceding an ordinary election. At that time, the elections for senators were held around mid-October and deputies around mid-November. So the cut-off period was actually 6.5 to 7.5 months prior to the election. So at the same time, the standing orders provided that the state shall not meet during any period of 21 days, ending with an ordinary election for senators or an ordinary election for deputies. So what we're trying to do, sir, is adapt the current arrangements to the present dates, which we have decided upon in this Assembly, in which the arrangements haven't followed. With regard to constables, sir, there is a slight difference, and the committee will bring the changes in due order to amend that. But at present, if a constable were to fall away, if I can use that term, a procureur du bien public can stand in to a certain extent for their duties in the parish, but not obviously in the state sitting. So the committee will be addressing that issue in due course. So I make the proposition and ask for the appel.
That has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. In relation to this vote, a simple majority only is required. I invite the greffier to open the voting. members have the opportunity of casting their votes. I ask the greffier to close the voting. Announce that the amendment has been adopted. 31 votes for, 14 votes contra. Now come to the final amendment of Deputy Jearn.
Sorry, sir, may I ask for the adjournment since it's nearly 5:30? I thought we might be able to take a half-hour break now.
Yes. Members content to adjourn now? Members content to adjourn now until 6 o'clock? Everybody's adjourned until 6 o'clock.